The huge monster, which looked like a lion, a wolf, and other powerful beasts at the same time, roared loudly, showing how ferocious it was. However, the team that had gathered to fight him was clearly not afraid of such a sight. The monster was not going to attack right away, but it was dangerous to wait for his blow. One of the team members shouted to the others that they needed to immediately go forward and attack first. No one resisted. Everyone understood that they needed to do everything possible to win. Fire appeared from the monster's mouth, which was directed towards the entire team, who knew that the monster would sooner or later make its move and try to injure or even destroy all the heroes. However, one of the heroes began to quickly spin his weapon, thereby creating a flow of air that did not allow the fire to penetrate closer. The man protected all the people who were near him so that they remained unharmed. The large animal did not give up. It continued to spew flames from its mouth. But no matter how hard it tried, the fire did not touch any of the heroes because they were under the reliable protection of their comrade. The man raised his hammer when he was sure that the stream of fire had stopped and that neither he nor his comrades were in any danger. The hero also noted that his opponent was very weak if his attack lasted so shortly and was unsuccessful. However, the man did not notice how the fire still touched him. The clothes began to catch fire, and the man, noticing that he was starting to burn, was surprised and began to shake his leg to put out the fire, which could have completely enveloped him. One of the guys, who was also a member of the team, noticing what was happening to the man, hurried to help him and with the help of some spell eliminated the problem, quickly putting out the fire. The young man had short dark hair, large round glasses, and lots of freckles. She held a book in one hand and cast a spell with the other. The young man asked to leave the healing to him so that everyone would focus on the battle. The other girl was dressed all in black, with a large hat on her head and a long staff in her hand. The girl also cast one of her spells, Ice Prison, to help her comrades in the battle. The spell worked, and the next moment there was a huge piece of ice in the monster's mouth. The girl turned the animal's flame into ice, thereby, firstly, confusing it, and secondly, making it very angry. Having neutralized her opponent, the girl helped him to be attacked by other members of the team. So the sorceress was followed by a warrior who was already ready to use his black sword. The guy quickly covered the distance between himself and the animal's muzzle to deliver the decisive blow and end the battle, which was not as easy as it seemed to the man defending the team. The young man jumped high into the air and kicked the monster in the nose, making him even more angry than before. However, all this was done on purpose, because the guy wanted to use his magic blade, which would help him shorten the battle time. The blow hit the target, so the monster was defeated. The guy was quite calm, so after he killed the big animal, he just grinned and said that his opponent, although big, was also too weak. After the warrior returned to the rest of the battle participants, someone called out to him and said that he was in a hurry again and was running ahead of everyone, without waiting for help from other people. The guy who reprimanded the hero for slaying the monster with his blade was Leonard. The dark-haired man didn't like it when the guy reprimanded him, so he asked him to shut up. The armored, blonde-haired youth chuckled and scratched the back of his head, as he found it amusing to watch his acquaintance react to his remarks. Also, one of those present noticed that it was precisely because of the sluggishness that the rank of the team that the young man with light hair was a member of was lower than that of the team of the man with dark hair, even though they were members of the same guild. Another person noted that there was no need to rush since the quest was a joint one, but the young man in armor added that the main thing was that the monster was defeated, so there was no point in arguing about anything. The man who had defeated the monster chuckled and looked at his companions, telling them that they should be grateful to him for leaving behind monsters that were less valuable than the one he had defeated. Deciding not to waste any more time on pointless conversations, the dark-haired man grabbed the boy standing nearby by the collar and added that they needed to leave already. The young man with the staff from the other team wondered if the boy had simply been sitting nearby and hiding behind a rock the entire time the heroes had been fighting. However, the guy in armor quickly clarified the truth. The young man looked back and revealed that the boy, who at first glance might have seemed useless to everyone, actually possessed the skill of experience distribution. The masked youth did not understand what this meant and asked his comrade to explain what he meant. As it turned out, the boy had a skill that allowed him to gain experience even without being on the battlefield, while other heroes were fighting. The young man in armor didn't know for sure, but he assumed that the boy wasn't just a member of his guildmate's team for nothing. Sometime later, the team gathered in a tavern to celebrate their victory over the great beast. The man who had defeated the monster raised his mug to honor everyone who sat at the table with him. The man made a toast and clinked glasses with his other comrades, celebrating the victory and success of Dawn and Glory. Everyone who had something poured into their mugs promised to drink the contents to the bottom. A man with short blonde hair drank some alcohol and said that their guild had become very strong. The man's name was Bonsa. He was a warrior, so he was always in front of everyone to take the brunt of the enemy. The young man, who wore large round glasses and was healing his comrades, also noted that the level of their team had indeed increased. The guy's name was Carl, and his role in the team was a monk. The young man wanted another member of the team to speak up, a dark-haired girl named Dorothy. The lady was a sorceress. The girl also noted that no guild could ever compare to them. Abruptly putting his mug on the table, the head of the Dawn of Glory Guild decided to attract the attention of his comrades, who confirmed the words of everyone present and added that their guild was the largest and strongest among all. Noticing that one member of the team was missing, the man asked where their boy was. The young man, who had the skill of experience distribution, was in another place on the street at the moment when his comrades were celebrating their common victory. The boy was muttering under his breath and complaining that he should not perform other people's duties. Walking down another alley, along which children were running and workers were unloading something, the young man looked at what he was holding in his hands and realized that he had forgotten something. As he passed another man unloading some boxes, the boy heard a man behind him notice that the load had started to fall. However, the young man did not want to leave anyone in trouble, so he managed to put his hand forward. The boy managed to come to the man's aid in time, holding the box in place so that it would not fall on the worker. The man saw that he was no longer in danger and thanked Field. Seeing the boy walking with some bags, the man asked him why he was being forced to do someone else's work again, because if this continued, he would never be able to become a famous adventurer. Field didn't want to listen to what he already knew, because he was obviously doing work he didn't want to do. The young man ran away, leaving the worker alone, saying at the end that he was in a hurry. After running a bit, the boy stopped to catch his breath. In reality, of course, he was not in a hurry, but he could not stay near the worker any longer. Looking around, the young man saw that the tavern where his team was very close. The boy went to it with the thought that he no longer wanted to carry out small errands. Entering the building, Field had mixed feelings. He knew he didn't want to be in the room. Claude, hearing the door open, said Field was late. Looking at the boy, the man asked why it took him so long to buy the recovery potions. Dorothy, without waiting for an answer, said that there was nothing surprising about it, because Field was only level 1. The sorceress also added that even such a simple request to buy potions was too difficult for the boy. However, someone from the team quickly apologized to Field for having to run around because of them. The young man was thinking only that his comrades would do better to make their own purchases instead of drinking in the tavern. Claude, putting his arm around the young man, persistently asked him if he would continue to help his team with his useful skill. The girl also leaned closer to Field and asked him not to be angry with his comrades. Dorothy added that since all the work was done by the others, the boy should not lay claim to the materials they received from the monster. Field didn't like this attitude towards him, so he pulled away from Claude and Dorothy so that they wouldn't touch him. The girl was amused by this. However, even despite his dissatisfaction with the current situation, the boy, although he wanted to express his opinion, remained silent and looked away. Deciding not to be around his team anymore, the boy left. Although Claude tried to persuade him to drink water with everyone, the young man refused, and Dorothy said that Field was very boring. However, the young man did not have time to leave the tavern, because the head of the guild called out to him and told him to stop. Claude didn't even look at Field, but simply raised his hand with a piece of paper and said that there was a new task for the boy. The man instructed the young man to check what was written on the note. One group was not doing its job, so they needed to reduce their payments a little. The boy did not object or say that he would not carry out the assignment. He took the note and hurried away. No one on the team wanted Field to celebrate with them, so Dorothy again simply noted that the boy had been very useful to them. Experience sharing was a skill that had been very helpful to the team. Just being in a group, Field helped double the experience points. The skill also meant that all the increased experience was distributed at the discretion of the skill owner. The sorceress once again noted that thanks to this skill, their guild, Dawn of Glory, became number 1 in the kingdom. However, the girl also added that their team's abilities should already be enough for something. The sorceress's assumption was confirmed by smiling Bonsa and Carl. While the team was discussing something about their common goal, Field was already in the room and lit his lamp, noting that changes were about to happen in the guild he was in. The boy lay on the bed and sighed loudly, thinking about what Claude had once again asked him to do. Picking up the note, the young man began to read what was written on it. Field read that he needed to reduce the experience of the white mage Maria and slightly reduce the experience of the warriors. as well as some other actions. The young man also thought about the fact that after several years of working in the Dawn of Glory Guild, his level had not increased. Field is usually kept in the rear, and all experience he receives must be divided between those who fight. The boy has no other skills except experience sharing, which allows him to double the group's experience. While the young man was changing the group indicators that were part of the guild, as Claude told him, he even thought about the fact that he didn't need a level. Field also recalled the past, in which the guild leader stroked his head and asked him about where he would like to join, inviting him to join him, because the man was sure that his guild Dawn of Glory would become the strongest of all. The boy gradually fell asleep and thought about how he was no longer the same as he used to be, after which he fell asleep. The next day, Field came to the guild leader and was shocked by what he heard. The boy could not believe what was happening to him, so he was very confused. Standing next to Claude were his comrades, who fully supported the decision of the guild leader. The man was serious and repeated what the boy could not believe. Claude decided that Field was no longer needed by his guild. Claude repeated his words once more and said that they were indeed kicking Field out of the team. They were grateful for his work, but they didn't need him anymore. The boy still couldn't believe what was happening. The young man tried to justify himself, saying that although his level remained low, he had made a huge contribution to the development of both the team and the entire guild as a whole. However, Dorothy decided to join the conversation, slowly approaching the boy. The girl poked her finger into the boy's chest and said that they no longer needed his experience. The sorceress looked down on her former comrade and wanted to explain to him that he was only needed to achieve the goal. Bonsa also shared the opinion of his comrades, saying that in terms of level and ability they were now unmatched. The man smiled, but his smile looked frightening. The warrior understood that the boy would not be able to fight back against any of them, so he also came closer to Field to intimidate him even more. The young man was taken aback. He really could not object to the words of those whom he himself had made much stronger than himself. Bonsa punched himself, straining so hard that the veins stood out on his face. He said that their team had already become the strongest of all, so no one wanted to keep the boy. Then Carl, who had been standing aside until then, joined the conversation. The guy adjusted his round glasses and agreed with his comrades, adding that the Dawn of Glory Guild did not need a useless ballast like Field. The guild leader turned to the young man again and asked him if he understood that all the members of Dawn of Glory were high level, so the presence of such a low-level person would only bring shame to the entire guild. Former comrades were hyping things up and saying that the boy no longer had any abilities other than experience distribution. He could not wield either a sword or magic. Everyone understood that at such a low level, the boy would have nothing to do. Field was horrified. He did not understand why he was treated so badly, because he did everything for the team, always did what he was asked to do, and did not take anything for himself to raise his own level. Claude saw how confused and scared the young man was, so he apologized to him without any regret, and added that all the guild members had made a unanimous decision to exclude Field from Dawn of Glory. However, the boy tried to cope with the feeling of fear and asked the head of the guild if everything would be okay and if they would demand anything from the young man. Claude did not understand what Field meant. The young man raised his head and confidently asked again if he could really just leave. The boy wanted to make sure that he was not in any danger in the form of persecution or anything like that. Everyone present looked at the young man with a surprised look, because no one expected that the boy would be able to ask questions so confidently and not just run away somewhere far away from fear. After a short pause, the company laughed, and Bonsa leaned closer to the young man and replied that this was exactly what they all meant. But it would have been more correct not to simply clarify something, but to immediately go somewhere and never return. Field ignored the taunts from his former comrades and silently walked forward, moving closer to the table where Claude was sitting. Bonsa didn't like the way the boy was ignoring him. Field asked the guild leader if everything would be okay, because if the boy left, no one else would be able to gain additional experience. However, the man assured that he understood everything and there would be no problems. Claude repeated that the boy could simply leave, since the Dawn of Glory Guild did not have enough spare money to support useless people. However, the boy continued to insist that he was very valuable. The boy said that not only Claude himself, but the entire guild would not be able to grow as quickly if they stopped using Field's skill to distribute experience. The boy's words began to irritate the guild leader. Because the man no longer wanted to listen to the comments and complaints addressed to him, he simply pushed and threw Field out of the room. The jolt caused the boy to fall down the stairs and hit his head hard, landing on his back. The boy's mouth began to wheeze in pain, and he was unable to get up right away. Claude had no pity for his former comrade because he was just using him. The guild leader said that he no longer wanted to hear useless noise from a man who was no longer needed by anyone. Later, the others came to the door. Bonsa was amused. It seemed that he enjoyed watching the boy's helplessness. Dorothy also gloated and offered to give the boy some money as a last gift so that he would not die of hunger. Field was also offered to take the old sword, since it was the only one suitable for a first-level adventurer. However, his former comrades weren't worried about Field, they just liked how nervous and afraid he was. The sorceress even suggested that the boy try begging when he ran out of money, since he would be good for it. The boys listened to Dorothy, but even they thought she was being too cruel in saying such things. However, the girl did not think she was overdoing it. She replied that she was only telling the truth because she really thought the boy was useless. The boy could no longer tolerate what his former comrades said about him. He was tired of listening to insults and accepting the way he was treated by the people for whom he tried so hard to do everything, sacrificing himself. The boy grabbed the old sword that had been thrown to him dismissively for laughs. Field placed the weapon in front of him and said that he had finally understood everything he needed to understand a long time ago. The boy activated his ability. Light windows appeared in front of the young man, which stored information about the experience of everyone he helped and doubled points for the fastest level up. Field began to squeeze his left palm, after which the windows gradually began to crack. Field said that if he was no longer needed by Claude, the team, or the guild, then he would do what he should have done back when he was given stupid orders. No one could have imagined that the boy's ability was not only doubling experience and distributing it in certain proportions. It turned out that the boy could also take back all the experience points that were earned in battles and appropriate them for himself. From that day on, when Field was expelled from the strongest guild, Dawn of Glory, he left, but took back everything that was taken from him a long time ago, deciding to make his former guild the weakest, so that all his comrades would understand what a mistake they made. Recalling one of the days when the boy was still a member of the Dawn of Glory Guild, he remembered an evening when he and his team went into a tavern where girls were serving many different dishes. One of the visitors noted that the best dish he had ever tasted was dragon meat. The grown man looked like he had already tried all the dishes in the world, so you wanted to trust his taste. The visitor began to praise the meat, saying that it was fatty and tasty and above all fresh. The taste was incomparable to anything else, because such food was intended only for adventurers, and it was impossible to find it in the ordinary market. When Claude saw how enthusiastically the boy listened to the story, he asked the boy why he was so interested in it. Field's mouth began to water, he couldn't help it. Waking up in the morning, the boy slowly opened his eyes. It turned out that he had fallen asleep in a tree, wrapped in a blanket to keep warm. After waking up, the boy noticed that his level was still rising. Stretching, the young man exhaled heavily and could not understand why he had a dream in which Claude treated him well, because the recent events had shaken him greatly. Looking above himself, Field saw how his level did not stop increasing. Deciding to take a walk to check how long it would take for his level to rise, the boy walked through the snow, but the growth never stopped. As he quickened his pace, the level up signs kept coming. So Field wondered how long it would take since it had been a long time, and the experience points were still being added and added. As the boy ran forward, he thought about how he had been distributing experience to all the guild members, so due to frequent battles, he had accumulated a lot of it. Deciding to no longer pay attention to the level increase and wait for it to stop, Field froze. The boy thought about the fact that in addition to experience, all the enhancements that his former comrades received could also return to him. If this really happens, then he will have a good result. Opening the table with detailed information about himself, the young man wanted to check what his characteristics and level were in general. Seeing what was written, Field was very surprised. The boy's hands trembled from the intense shock, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing with his own eyes. The boy's status was significantly different from what he had when he was a member of the guild. Even the royal guards were not as strong as Field with his new stats, so he never imagined that he would gain so many experience points after taking them from his former teammates. Realizing his situation, the young man thought that with his new stats, he could finally do something he never thought he could do when he was in the Dawn of Glory Guild. While the boy's level was still rising, he thought about what he could do after he gained strength. Field thought that he could become a knight. On the other hand, he could be rich and become a first-class adventurer, because before, due to his weakness, he didn't have a chance for something like that. Remembering Claude, the young man thought that he could, like him, become the head of his own guild, founding it and finding new comrades. Seeing how his level was still rising, Field decided that his goal now would be to create his own guild, one that would definitely not be like Dawn of Glory, which treated him terribly. The boy also could not forget his recent dream about how he heard from an old man a story about a dish that was only available to a strong adventurer. After leaving the forest, Field went to the city, because he decided for himself that he would do everything to try dragon meat as soon as possible. Entering the room, the boy was met at the counter by a girl who smiled at the new visitor and greeted him. She said that the young man had found himself in the Adventurers Guild of the Kingdom of Altia. The girl also, after learning that the man's name was Field Electoria, told him that if he was in the guild for the first time, he should fill out the necessary paperwork for new members. The kind girl also asked what task the boy would like to take, to which Field replied that he would like to take an order for dragons. The people present inside the guild began to look around warily. The girl who stood behind the counter was very surprised by such a request from the young man and asked again if she had heard the boy correctly, because she clearly did not expect that Field would be interested in something so dangerous and difficult. The boy explained that he wanted to take on the task of the dragon because he really wanted to try its meat. Suddenly, someone who was standing nearby and heard what the young man was talking about laughed. The man with the scar on his face laughed loudly because the short story that the boy told made him laugh. Field was a little confused and did not know how to react to such an attitude from an adult. The man looked at the young man and told him that he had been a member of the guild for a long time, but even he had not been able to cope with the dragon, so a newbie like Field would certainly not be able to cope with such a difficult and dangerous task. The man did not leave the boy alone and told him to show him his strength, but the girl quickly reminded him that fights were prohibited in the guild, and the young man himself did not want to get involved in any conflicts or fight with people. The man turned out to be several times bigger than the boy himself. The adult man decided to show that he was much stronger than the young man, so he defeated Field before the dragon did. The man was provoking the boy to show him what he was capable of, because Field looked like he couldn't resist anyone. The adult didn't wait for the boy's reaction and wanted to quickly assert himself at his expense. The old man made a blow, which Field managed to dodge, but the boy still did not expect that the man was so serious that he actually started a fight. The young man did not think that his words about wanting to defeat the dragon would surprise anyone so much. The other guild members watched with interest what was happening and even encouraged the man to finish the fight quickly, to show the boy that he had clearly overestimated his strength. However, the girl standing at the counter asked him to stop. Fighting was prohibited in the guild, so the girl called on everyone to stop, especially since it was wrong to be so aggressive towards a new member of the guild. The man asked the administrator not to worry because he only wanted to teach the boy a lesson, not to fight him seriously. While the old man was throwing punches, Field skillfully dodged, which slightly irritated the adult. The man also decided to tell the boy that dragons are many times stronger and faster, so you can't just dodge and avoid blows. However, Field was only waiting for the right moment, until his opponent believed that with such powers as the young man's, he could really defeat someone serious, much less a dragon. However, a few seconds later, something happened that no one could have expected. The boy grabbed the man and with one jerk knocked his opponent down, not giving him a chance to strike back or even get up. Everyone present opened their mouths in surprise and did not know what to say. The man looked much stronger and more experienced than the young man everyone had seen for the first time, so no one wanted to believe that the boy was so strong. After a short pause, those present began to actively discuss what had happened. Some could not even believe their own eyes, so they began questioning those who were standing closest to the opponents. Field didn't want to fight, so after everything happened, he put his hand on the man's shoulder and tried to tell him something. But the adult man couldn't understand what had happened to him and why he was lying on the floor. The boy leaned over to his seated opponent and apologized to him, saying that he had surprised him a lot. The young man also began to get a little nervous and asked if everything was okay with the old man since he was ready to help him. The girl standing behind the counter opened her eyes wide and couldn't find the words to comment on what she had to see, because she would never have thought that a new member of the guild could defeat an experienced adventurer so easily. The administrator also did not believe what was happening because Field seemed to her to be still a child, but she was brought out of her thoughts by the voice of a young man who called her. The boy bowed and apologized to the girl for causing a mess inside the guild hall. The young man also apologized for all the inconvenience he had caused. After the apology, the boy decided to ask the administrator again about what he had said earlier. The girl was a little taken aback, as the situation that had happened did not allow her to quickly come to her senses. However, after some time, the administrator exhaled to concentrate on her work, and remembered that earlier the boy asked her for a task that would involve fighting a dragon. The girl at the counter replied that the guild had recently received information that dragons might have appeared far to the north of the royal capital, in the Nautilus Mountains. While the administrator was telling the boy the information he was interested in, everyone present couldn't take their eyes off him. Meanwhile, The girl continued to talk about how there were many caravans on the road to the Nautilus Mountains. The young man heard what he wanted and hurried to leave the guild, because the main thing for him was to find the dragons. Field thanked the administrator and told the surprised girl that he was going to go to the Nautilus Mountains immediately. The girl tried to warn the young man and shouted to him that it was dangerous to go to that area alone, because even in a group of adventurers it is difficult to cope with one dragon. However, the administrator was not heard. The boy had already run away from the guild building before she wanted to tell him not to go there. After Field left the Altia Kingdom Guild, she noticed that someone wanted to contact her. When she answered the call, she realized that someone was interested in a boy named Field. The receptionist told the person on the other end of the call that the boy was interested in dragons and had traveled to the years of Nautilus in order to defeat them alone. The girl also learned that the young man used to be a member of the Dawn of Glory Guild, which lost its power after the boy left it. The administrator added that Field was incredibly strong, as she saw his strength with her own eyes. As the boy ran further and further away from his new guild, he was happy and looked forward to going on a new adventure, where no one would command him and use him as they did before, because now he would fight on his own. As the boy ran up to the gate that separated the kingdom's territory from the forest, the young man shouted that he was heading to the places where dragons were found, while the rest of the people moved calmly around the kingdom. Elsewhere, the sounds of swords clashing against each other as their wielders struck each other in training could be heard. Bonsa stood by the wall, his hands folded on his chest. Later, Carl approached him and asked who the warrior had brought to them. Bonsa replied that he had recently found an adventurer who was very capable and talented. Looking at the girl, the warrior asked the monk what he thought of her, seeing how she fought. It seemed that the girl did not put much effort into fighting her opponent, because the man who tried to fight her back could not stand it and fell to the floor, thereby admitting his defeat. The girl had blonde hair, she was wearing a robe, she held a book in one hand, and the other hand held the hilt of a weapon. The man who was defeated called her a monster because she was very strong. Claude, who was standing nearby, said that he congratulated the stranger because she really was worthy of the title of her sword. The head of the guild, Dawn of Glory, smiled and even clapped the girl for her skill. However, the mysterious girl with blonde hair was not too happy with such words of praise addressed to her. So she responded to the compliment without much enthusiasm with a simple "thank you" and fell silent. It seemed that Claude didn't expect anything from the girl, so he didn't say anything more either, but just continued to smile slightly. However, there was one among the team who was irritated by the current situation to a significant degree. Dorothy bit her nails in anger and asked Claude if he was exaggerating the new girl's accomplishments. The sorceress did not like the way the man treated her like a princess just because she had few skills. Although the girl with dark hair was too irritated and dissatisfied, the girl with light hair decided to prove that she really knew how to fight and was an excellent warrior. The girl with the cloak covering her face took up the sword again and began to attack the man who had already managed to defeat her earlier. After the girl struck, she counted the times when the sword could have killed the man. Swinging once again, the girl advanced and confidently attacked the man, who barely had time to dodge the weapon. However, the man did not have enough stamina to avoid all the attacks in his direction, so he only backed away while the girl caught up with him and touched his body with her sword. After the fifth time, the girl pointed the sword at the man, who was already lying on the ground, and said that he would have died 5 times over if this had been a real fight. The girl also noted that her opponent had big gaps in his defense, and that was why he missed her blows. The adult no longer wanted to listen to anything and only asked her not to approach him since he would admit his defeat. It turned out that the blonde girl's name was Lunasis. She was praised again by Claude, who clapped his hands and added that even he would have a hard time standing up to such a skilled and talented girl. Lunasis again wasn't impressed by the praise she received. It seemed like she didn't like the fact that she was so good with a sword. However, this look did not anger Claude, but the man who had been defeated several times. The man did not like the fact that he was defeated by some girl who was younger than him, so he did not want her to look down on him. While Lunasis had her back to the man, he attacked her with a sword, but the girl clearly guessed about such a sudden attack, so she quickly understood what she needed to do. Slamming her book shut, which she always kept with her even in battle, Lunasis tossed it to show how casual she was even when suddenly attacked from behind. Carl, seeing what was happening, noted that women were scary when angry, and Bonsa said that her rival was to blame himself since he could not accept defeat. The warrior also added that such beauties loved only themselves. Carl did not understand what his comrade meant, so he asked again where Bonsa got the idea that such girls were so narcissistic, to which the warrior replied that he himself came up with it. While the friends were chatting, Claude was talking about something with Lunasis, after which the girl with blonde hair left and the guild leader returned back. After Claude came closer, Dorothy asked him what he and Lunasis had been talking about for so long. Although the girl thought they had discussed something important, the man replied that there had been nothing special in the conversation. As it turned out, the girl with blonde hair was asking Claude about Field's disappearance. Dorothy was surprised by such a topic of conversation and even got a little tense, because she did not understand why Lunasis needed the boy. Claude also said that he was deliberately deceiving Lunasis by telling her that he was only allowing Field to rest for a while. However, the girl insists that she wants to talk to the boy and meet him soon. The blonde girl wanted to see the person who had the skill, experience, distribution. Dorothy, after listening to the guild leader, said that they would never have thought that Lunasis agreed to come to them in order to see Field. The sorceress also added that such an excuse would not last long, so she asked what they would do next, but Claude replied that there was nothing they could do. The guild leader said that he would pay Field to return the sword that they themselves gave him, since it was sacred. Something else might have to be done to get the weapon back. However, Dorothy was against it and said that they should not solve problems because of some boy. Carl asked Bones if the warrior had tried to challenge the sacred sword, to which the man replied that he had decided not to do so. The young man in round glasses thought the man was behaving unusually carefully, to which the warrior replied that he simply had a bad feeling about the weapon. The monk could not understand what bad feeling his companion was talking about. Bonsa explained that it was like their bodies were losing their advantage in everything. The warrior also noted that lately he felt like the equipment he always wore was getting heavier than before. However, Carl asked to end the conversation because he had received a message. After the monk saw what he had been told, he immediately called out to Dorothy and Claude, who were still talking together. After the couple turned to look at the young man with the round glasses, the monk told them that the boy was most likely heading towards the northern mountains. Carl also added that it looked like he had taken the quest alone and was heading to Nautilus on his own. The guild leader wondered why the young man had gone to such a place alone, since it was incredibly dangerous even for the team. However, after thinking for a bit, Claude figured everything out, which is why he even froze in surprise for a while. After a short pause, Claude laughed loudly and said that he understood everything. Carl, on the contrary, could not understand what was going on and why the guild leader was acting so strangely. Claude suggested that Field, being a member of the Dawn of Glory Guild, mistakenly believed that he himself had become stronger when the guild he belonged to became the strongest and most famous. The guild leader tried to explain his train of thought to his comrades and said that the boy had foolishly taken on the task alone, overestimating his strength and hoping that he would be lucky. Also in Claude's plan and thoughts were the thoughts that the boy would fail and fall into some gorge when bandits attacked him, after which the young man would die, never returning back. The head of the Dawn of Glory Guild noted that this would be the best scenario that could happen to the boy. Dorothy laughed and said that this was their chance to say goodbye to Field forever, because no normal person would go to the mountains alone. Bonsa wondered how they would deal with Field, but the sorceress reminded him that it was still the strongest guild of all. The girl was confident in their plans, so she smiled evilly and looked forward to the implementation of their common plan. Claude said that they needed to find someone with peaceful abilities who could easily assist them, so they should start searching immediately. The head of the Dawn of Glory Guild also noted that in addition to preparation, he wanted to be present at the moment when Field was destroyed, because he wanted to make sure that he would never cause them problems again. Dorothy smiled and said, the man's words were quite encouraging, however, they all had to be careful. So the sorceress said that she also wanted to go with the guild leader. Carl noted that if both Dorothy and Claude were present, then Field would never be able to escape, because they would prevent him from resisting and would finish him off once and for all, because both of them could be called the heads of the Dawn of Glory Guild. Claude is a man who was an all-powerful magician of magic swords. He was incredibly strong because his skill and experience were amazing, and his strength and power were also always at their best. Dorothy is a girl who was the greatest mage with the strongest abilities. She could be compared to Claude in strength because she also possessed outstanding skills and useful abilities. The monk, thinking about what awaited Field if he met Claude and Dorothy again, had no doubt that the young man would die, because Carl himself was sometimes afraid of such strong people, who, moreover, were now very evil. In all seriousness, Claude ordered to find some rough guys to join the Dawn of Glory Guild, specifically their team to clean up the trash from the mountains. Claude was serious. He was preparing his team for the fact that they would soon need to get even with their former comrade. At this time, Lunasis was somewhere in the kingdom, and reading a book, thought that she would soon have the opportunity to see a person who had the skill of experience distribution. At the same time, Field was already heading to the northern mountains to fulfill his goal and fight the dragons, after which he would surely be lucky enough to taste his cherished dish. This time, the head of the Dawn of Glory Guild did not think about letting the boy go so easily, so he would not rest until he dealt with him. At this time, Field enjoyed his journey and thought about how soon he would have a delicious meal. As it turned out, the girl who worked as an administrator in the Guild of the Kingdom of Altia was indeed right, because on the way to the mountains, many caravans gathered, which went through the forest, which was located next to the mountains. One of the men who owned all the carts stopped and began to look around, because he did not understand why there was a huge line, but later someone called out to the man from behind. It turned out that the one who ran to the man was the man who said that the owner of the cart should immediately move away, because it was no longer possible to continue the journey. However, the man did not understand what was being said. The man who came up to him, realizing that the man really didn't know anything, decided to tell him that the way to the valley was impossible through the northern forest, because closer to the mountains, a dragon had appeared and was roaming freely. The owner of the caravan became nervous and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He could not believe what the man who approached him was saying, because it was simply a disaster, since a large amount of goods needed to be delivered to the valley. If the caravan could not travel along the usual route, it would have to extend its route, which would be 3 or 4 days longer than planned, since this road was the best one to reach the mountain range. However, the tall man insisted that it was not worth the risk. The workers, hearing that they would have to be delayed, were not happy with this news, and it was also decided that some of the food would have to be left behind to distract the dragon and have time to leave. One of the men said that he had already contacted the guild, but they had not given him an exact answer as to when someone would arrive who could help them. While everyone was in despair, Field had just managed to reach the standing caravan. Seeing the young man, they hastened to stop him to warn him that where he was going there was a dragon, which one could not simply pass by and remain unharmed. People did not understand why the boy did not listen to them and did not intend to stop, so someone assumed that the young man was a new adventurer. However, although the guild sent reinforcements, they did not say when exactly they would arrive. Field didn't want to listen to warnings that he needed to look for a way around the road where the dragon appeared, because he was an adventurer who just happened to have a mission and was specifically going to fight the dragon. The man who was the owner of the caravan looked at the serious-minded boy and became worried about him, after which he gently took him by the shoulders to stop him. The tall man said that everyone understood that the boy was a new adventurer, but such a path was still too dangerous for him alone, because the dragon was very scary and big. Field became stubborn and said that he had not lied when he said that he was going specifically to the dragon. However, the men began to say that dragons were creatures that required several adventurers to defeat, not just one. It would have been foolish to attempt such a feat on his own, since the duel could end in the death of the brave hero. But the man interrupted his speech after he saw the boy's sword. The caravan master took Field by the shoulders again and began to shake him, which scared the young man a little, because he did not expect such behavior. The man recognized the emblem that was engraved on the sacred sword. It turned out that the sacred sword emblem showed the boy's affiliation with the Dawn of Glory Guild, which greatly surprised the men present. The people around heard what the caravan owner said and began to discuss Field, because the Dawn of Glory Guild was still the strongest, although the young man had not been a part of it for some time. After the unexpected discovery, the short man assumed that the boy was a fairly resilient person, and apologized for speaking so confidently about the boy not being able to handle the dragon alone. However, Field did not hold a grudge against the man. The young man understood that they were simply worried about him because of his appearance. The caravan owner added that they were carrying food, medicine, and clothing to people who were in dire need of provisions, so the caravan could not be behind schedule. The short man realized that Field was the hope that the caravan would not have to spend another 3 or 4 days to bypass the dangerous area. The caravan master asked Field to deal with the dragon by any means necessary and help the caravan reach its destination as soon as possible. The boy was serious, so he promised to do everything in his power. The young man did not waste any more time and ran ahead to fulfill his promise and help the people who needed provisions. The owner of the caravan watched the boy go and hoped that nothing would really happen to him, and that he would cope with the dragon in order to clear the way for the carts. Later, someone appeared next to the man who owned the caravan. The adult thought that it was the traveler's friend whom he had recently met, since he was the one who had contacted the man earlier. It turned out that Claude had appeared in front of the caravan master, with Dorothy also standing behind him. The short man said that the boy had already run away and was climbing up the forest road not long ago. Elsewhere in the same forest, birds could be seen in the sky, flying carefree near the treetops. However, not all birds were lucky enough to remain in the sky, as some of them often became food for the dragon that had recently been living in the forest. Field, having finally reached his goal, noticed that the dragon was very close to him, but the young man was in no hurry to immediately rush into battle with him, because he understood that although he had gained strength and significantly increased his level, he was still not omnipotent. Using the ability analysis, the boy realized that the dragon in front of him was a top-level monster, namely a red dragon. Taking hold of the hilt of his sword, Field looked straight into the eyes of his future opponent and said that this was the creature that blocked the road for the caravans that needed to pass through the forest in order to deliver provisions to the people on time. The dragon seemed to understand that this was not an ordinary boy in front of him, so the monster simply looked at the man, not trying to immediately attack him or eat him like the birds flying in the sky. The dragon continued to look at the boy and do nothing. He didn't even roar or breathe fire, so the boy was a little confused. However, after some time, the monster decided to do something and began to turn around. Field did not understand why the dragon did not simply attack him, trying to destroy him, like the other monsters he had seen fighting. After the dragon turned away from the boy, Field asked him, as if the monster could answer him, why it was simply looking away and seemed to avoid a confrontation with a potential rival. However, the young man did not notice that the dragon was doing everything on purpose to use its tail. Field noticed the attack only when it was already impossible to dodge. The monster's tail hit the tree next to which the boy was standing with such force that its trunk split into several pieces, and the pieces flew in different directions. After the blow, the dragon showed with all his appearance how strong he really was, not rushing to turn back to the one who so fearlessly came to him to fight. Hearing the boy admire the monster's strength and power, the monster turned around and looked at Field, who was completely unharmed. The only thing that happened to the guy was a small bruise, because he was pushed against the same tree from which only a stump remained. Field rubbed the back of his head and said that his head was covered by a wooden stump which protected him. The next moment, the dragon hit another tree with its tail, causing it to also collapse, turning into splinters. The monster became more aggressive and now growled at the boy, frightening him with its roar. Field was tense. He understood that the monster seemed to be playing with him at the beginning, but now it became more serious. The dragon's roar was incredibly pressing, and because of this, the young man's fingers went numb from the strain, since this was Field's first battle, in which he was also completely alone. The dragon stopped roaring for a while, and the boy noted to himself that his first fight had been very difficult, and his opponent had already shaken him to the depths of his soul. After a short pause, the monster became ferocious again, and opening its mouth, it spewed out a lot of fire, which spread over a large area. However, the flames were directed exactly where the boy was. The fire set fire to the tree stump, but the boy himself was no longer in his former place. After the fire died down a bit, the monster looked at the burning stump and did not see the one he had attacked there. Field managed to move behind the dragon and added that he was surprised by his opponent's behavior. Hearing the voice of the man behind him, the monster did not waste time turning around. It decided to use its tail again, acting so quickly that the boy did not have time to dodge the blows. However, the young man had expected such an action from the dragon, skillfully dodging so that the tail would not touch him. Field shouted to his opponent and said that he had already seen such a move from him, so nothing surprised him anymore. The monster realized that his actions were not successful, so he gradually began to get angry. The dragon also realized that he could not fight with his tail alone against the boy, who quickly adapted to the situation. Having decided on a new tactic, the dragon quickly turned around and tried to reach the boy with other parts of its body, but Field only covered himself from the dust that rose around him. The monster stopped using its tail and decided to simply run forward to grab its prey with its paws and make it stop running away and resisting. The dragon confidently advanced and did not stop, but he did not understand that his strength did not always help him, because due to his large size, Field could more effectively dodge and avoid blows from the enemy. Using its front paw, the dragon struck the ground exactly where the boy was standing, but the monster did not realize that the boy's reaction was much better than his own. After the dragon saw that there was nothing under his paw, he heard a sound from above and raised his muzzle to see what was rapidly approaching him from the sky. It turned out that Field had deliberately risen into the air to make a surprise attack while falling. The young man succeeded, and holding the sword tightly, he struck the dragon's neck, knocking it to the ground. Field put a lot of effort into making the weapon hit the monster, but the dragon's skin was very hard. For a moment, the guy thought that he would not be able to quickly deal with the monster. However, Field assured himself that the sword he held in his hands was sharp enough to pierce the monster's skin right through. Field also thought for a few seconds that due to the force he was applying, he could damage the sword, which reminded him of the past, but later the young man discarded such thoughts, because the main thing for him was to defeat the dragon. Field cast aside all doubts and continued to hold his sword tightly in order to deal with the monster he had come for, as well as to fulfill the promise he had made to the caravan master to help the people who needed provisions. The dragon could not resist, so after a while he completely stopped showing signs of life, after which the young man jumped off his back and began to even out his breathing. The boy's cheeks turned red with excitement. However, the young man was very happy because he had defeated a strong opponent on his own. Field began to jump for joy, rejoicing in his victory. Later the boy stopped, repeating over and over again the fact that he had completed the task. Field's hands were shaking with excitement and pride in himself. The young man saw that the monster was dead, but he still could not fully believe what had happened. Field also realized that even from one dragon, there was a lot of meat that he had wanted to try for so long. Looking down, the boy also saw that he had stepped on the blood that had flowed out of the carcass. Looking at the body of the defeated monster, the young man thought that it would be nice to drink some of the dragon's blood, but he was unsure whether he should do it somewhere else or as soon as possible. The boy's idyll of happiness was interrupted by someone's voice calling Field by name. The boy immediately understood who the sound belonged to, so he became a little wary and tense. Not far from the boy stood his former comrades, who had come to Field to get rid of him. Claude decided to interrupt a short pause and, smiling, said that they had not seen each other for a long time. The head of the Dawn of Glory Guild asked the boy if he missed him. Claude, being very irritated, also held the caravan master hostage, who was gradually finding it difficult to breathe. Field saw that not only Claude had come to see him, but also a sorceress named Dorothy, who had laughed at the boy so much when he left the guild. The young man could not understand why his former comrades who had driven him away were now seeking a meeting with him, to which the girl interrupted him and said that their new sacred sword was looking for Field, so they decided to meet quickly. The sorceress smiled and said that it would be better for the young man to return with them immediately voluntarily, then problems could be avoided. However, Field did not agree. The boy was angry because he remembered how the people in front of him treated him. However, Claude was prepared for such a reaction, so he put his sword to the man's neck and showed him what he could do if he refused. The leader of the Dawn of Glory Guild lowered his voice and muttered that the boy needed to listen carefully. Claude wanted Field to do him a favor to save all the people who were at the caravan. The dark-haired man said that if the boy did not go with them, then many monsters would attack all the people who were in the forest, and also added that they would complete the task that the boy took instead of him. Only after Claude had said everything did the boy realize that the leader of the Dawn of Glory Guild had indeed taken hostages. Dorothy looked behind the boy and saw that there was something large lying next to him. The sorceress looked more closely and asked Claude if it was really the defeated red dragon lying behind Field. The dark-haired man seemed to think for a moment when he saw the monster's carcass, but then replied that he was sure that someone else had defeated the dragon and left, and that the boy had simply been in the right place at the right time. Afterwards, the leader of the Dawn of Glory Guild turned to the boy again and told him that his adventure was over, so he needed to get rid of himself. Claude used his burning ground ability, stabbing his sword into the ground. However, after activating the skill, the dark-haired man realized that his sword, which had never seemed heavy to him, had become much heavier. Claude did not understand what was happening. He began to be overcome with horror from the realization that he was losing strength. Dorothy was also confused after seeing that something had gone wrong with Claude. The man was thinking that he could not pull out the sword not only because it had become heavier, but also because his magical abilities had changed dramatically. The sorceress did not waste time and pointed her staff towards the boy. The girl was angry because everything was not going as she and Claude had planned. Dorothy used her Ice Hell ability and decided that she could do what her comrade couldn't. After the girl activated her ability and directed it towards the young man, it did not produce the desired effect, but simply cooled the guy, who even liked to feel the cool freshness on himself. Field said that he even liked what Dorothy did, but the girl, like Claude, was horrified. She could not believe that the great power of her freezing skill was completely different from before. The sorceress's hands trembled. She did not want to believe that the level of her skill had dropped to the point where it could be compared to the cold magic of any beginner with a low amount of experience. The man who was hired to hold civilians hostage became scared and approached the head of the Dawn of Glory Guild to find out what was going on, because the plan was completely different. While the hired man held the tied-up man, Field came up behind him and struck the blonde man, who complained that he had not been warned about some unforeseen moments. The boy shook his hands and said that the man was too inattentive, because he didn't even notice how someone approached him from behind. The young man didn't put much effort into making the enemy harmless. Field was annoyed. He didn't think that Claude would want to use other people to join the guild and help him search. and later even threatened the young man who was forcibly kicked out of the team. Having finished with the stranger, the boy looked at the head of the guild he used to be a part of and asked him what all his words and actions meant. Why Claude was looking for the young man and wanted him to either return or die on the spot. The head of the Dawn of Glory Guild didn't even think of answering any questions from his former comrade. The dark-haired man was irritated by everything that concerned Field because Claude did not consider him his equal. The grown man did not wait any longer for the right moment, and due to the overwhelming emotions, simply rushed towards the guy, insulting him. Field didn't get confused. He saw Claude running at him with a sword, so he understood what he needed to do, although he still wanted to know the answers to his questions and not get into a fight. The dark-haired young man spared no effort. He no longer wanted to endure the terrible treatment and disdain towards himself from those to whom he had previously obeyed, respected, and listened. Dorothy immediately ran up to the head of the Dawn of Glory Guild, worried about his well-being. The sorceress tried to ease the pain of her comrade, who did not expect to be pushed away so strongly, while Field decided to say that he did not want to get involved with Claude and Dorothy or anyone from the Dawn of Glory Guild anymore. The head of the guild the boy belonged to did not lose consciousness, so he heard perfectly everything that the young man, who was slowly approaching closer and closer, was telling him. Field no longer acted like he was scared, as he had changed a lot since he was kicked out of the guild. The young man's gaze was confident, so he added that he would try to forget everything that connected him with his past teammates. The girl didn't want to hear anything else, especially since she wasn't prepared for the fact that the boy, whom everyone considered weak, would be able to fight back. The sorceress stood up and decided that she and Claude needed to leave the forest immediately to figure out what to do next, because their plan hadn't worked, which meant they had to come up with another way to fight the new Field. Using one of her spells, Dorothy, helped by Claude, decided to move to another place. Where the couple had been, dust rose from which the boy covered his face. Also, smoke appeared in the place where his former comrades were, due to which Field was unable to see what was happening to the members of the Dawn of Glory Guild. As the dark-haired young man waited for the smoke to clear and the dust to settle, the only people left around him were those the boy's former comrades had taken hostage. Field was a little taken aback, as he had not thought that such strong Claude and Dorothy could simply run away. The young man was distracted from his thoughts by the coughing of the men who were lying on the ground. The boy came closer to the owner of the caravan and the man who was next to him and asked if they were okay, if they were hurt. The adults replied that they were okay, but they were a little scared about what had happened. The boy was a little nervous, as he also did not fully understand what exactly his former comrades wanted from him. The men thanked the boy for saving them, while Field thought that it was his fault, since Claude and Dorothy had come here for him. The caravan owner also noted that the young man had defeated the dragon and had done it all alone. The man also added that monsters are usually brought to the city to be sold for raw materials, but it would be difficult for the boy alone. To somehow thank the young man, the caravan master offered to take one of his carts and load the monster's carcass into it. However, the boy wanted to do something else first. A little later, the man was roasting meat over a fire and talking about how, although dragons were dangerous, their horns and organs could be used in medicine, and their skin was good for making armor, their claws for weapons, and their meat was considered a valuable delicacy. There was also a saying among travelers that said that a dragon has no part that is not useful. The owner of the caravan asked if the boy would be sorry to share such a valuable thing with someone. Field was not greedy and replied, watching the man cook, that he would not be able to eat it all anyway. And besides, the caravan master helped him divide the remains of the carcass. Field couldn't wait to try what he had been dreaming about for so long. After some time, the man finally cooked dragon kebab with spices and added that such spices are the best of all that can be found in this area. The boy didn't even wait for the meat to cool down, so he carefully began to bite off pieces, from which a pleasant aroma came, increasing Field's appetite even more. The meat was perfectly cooked. It seemed that the owner of the caravan often cooked. The dish was firm but at the same time very easy to chew. The sweet sauce on the meat was so rich that when the boy bit into a piece, it dripped off the edge. The meat was also slightly spicy, causing the boy's tongue to tingle slightly. The caravan master asked his savior if he liked dragon meat, to which the boy replied that this dish was the best he had ever tasted in his entire life, just as the tavern visitor and seasoned adventurer had said. The men thanked and praised their savior, offering him drinks and food, and Field finally felt much better, because now his efforts were appreciated. However, while Field was rejoicing over his victory over the dragon, Claude, who had been rebuffed by his former boy who carried out any orders, was very angry and did not know what he should do to correct the situation. Returning to the guild where the boy had taken the quest to catch the dragon, Field placed the monster's horn on the table. which amazed not only the girl who worked as an administrator, but also other people who had become members of the guild before the boy. At the same time, in the palace of the kingdom of Altia, the old king sat on the throne, receiving a visit from the guild Dawn of Glory. The king was calm, but it seemed as if he was very dissatisfied with those who were in front of him. The head of the guild, Claude Glamatic, and his comrades, members of the said guild, bowed their heads before the old man. The people bowed and closed their eyes out of respect and a little excitement before the head of the kingdom. Looking at the people who had bowed their heads, the ruler said that the reason he had called them to the palace was because he had several questions that he wanted answered quickly. The king learned that a dragon had been destroyed in the streets of Nautilus the other day, and the merchants who were there complained that the guild members and their comrades had captured them and held them hostage for some time. Lunasis was curious about the situation, as she was not aware of what had happened. Later, the king also added that the merchants were unexpectedly freed by a young man who was able to help them. The ruler of the kingdom demanded an explanation, after which Claude, as the guild leader, replied that he found the recent situation quite disappointing. The dark-haired man chose his words carefully, as he knew who he was speaking to. The king did not understand what Claude meant, so the guild leader quickly added that although, as his majesty already knew, Dawn of Glory had always prided itself on being the best in the entire kingdom, the situation had changed slightly. Claude lied about someone. The one who claimed to be the strongest guild had framed Dawn of Glory by deception, and it was also not true that the situation that had happened was planned by one of his guild members. Dorothy, who did not dare to raise her head or even open her eyes, was nervous and thought that she was impressed that Claude could be so unperturbed. Altia Kingdom asked if it was true that the Dawn of Glory Guild was not involved in the recent incident. Claude replied that it was, since they had all been busy in the council chamber for the past few days. The king believed the man. The Lord of Altia added that people who commit evil under the name of the Dawn of Glory Guild is a serious matter, because such situations may not be isolated, which will defile the reputation of the strongest guild. The king also noted that he had heard that the guild members had very outstanding abilities, but recently Claude had rejected many applications for membership that were unsuccessful. The Lord of the Kingdom of Altia also said that he thought it was important to attract capable candidates, but taking care of those already in the guild was also an important task for Claude as the leader. The king gave instructions that if one recalls past unfortunate events, carelessness and overconfidence, all this could lead to the guild's destruction, so one should never forget about one's own responsibility. The king looked at everyone who bowed their heads before him and said that it should be obvious to them that they should resolve and close the issue of the recent unpleasant situation as soon as possible so that it does not become public knowledge. The overlord also added that the guild members would be informed of any news that affected the kingdom's reputation as soon as it came out, so they should all be on guard. Seeing that those present listened attentively to his words, the king said that everyone could be free and at liberty to leave. But before leaving, Claude bowed and said that the Lord could be sure of their unwavering loyalty. The dark-haired man kept his eyes closed to hide his irritation. The leader of the Dawn of Glory Guild thought that being scolded by the king was the humiliation he and his comrades felt because of Field. While Claude hated the boy in his thoughts, Lunasis only thought that there was no way a humble first-level traveler could defeat a strong dragon on his own, because it was simply impossible. The girl assumed that the young man could not possibly have leveled up in such a short period of time, since he had been kicked out of Dawn of Glory only recently. Lunasis did not know how something like that could have happened. While the members of the guild that Field had previously belonged to were at a reception with the king, the boy drank hot tea, which he had previously been unable to afford due to the fact that he had no money or savings of his own. Field held the mug carefully and exhaled a little heavily, because this kind of pastime was new to him. The boy would never have thought that he would be given 100 gold coins as a reward for defeating the red dragon. When the girl in the guild gave him a bag of money, the young man was even a little confused before taking it for himself. Field had never seen so much money before, and now it belonged to him alone. That's why the guy decided to visit a cafe where there was no one else, to try to enjoy the moment. Looking around, the boy noticed that earrings and other jewelry containing precious stones were lying on the display case. It turned out that the room the boy was in belonged to the man who owned the caravan. Field could not even imagine that he had recently saved such a rich merchant because he had everything, from jewelry to medicines and various weapons. However, the short man was very modest. He approached the boy and asked that it was not even close to what he thought the young man. Field called the owner of the caravan Mr. Gonzalez. He was just offering the boy some snacks for tea. Field tried to refuse and replied that he only wanted to drink tea and not eat anything. The man hesitated a little, because he had invited the boy to his place to thank him, so he insisted that the young man eat. Having finally tasted what Mr. Gonzalez had offered the boy, the young man was surprised at how delicious the cakes were. However, while the people were talking, they did not notice a tall man enter the room. The grown man apologized for interrupting someone else's conversation, but hastened to say that he had come to this place because he had been told about a traveler named Field Electria who was here. The young man, as soon as he heard his name, turned to face the unknown man, wiping his mouth from crumbs. The guy answered that he was the one the man was looking for, but he did not understand why someone was looking for him. The grown man bowed in greeting, causing the boy to immediately stand up from the table. The stranger apologized for his rudeness and said that he was a member of the royal guard who had come because the king wanted to meet him. The man put his hand on his heart and added that he had also been informed that Field had been given a reward for killing a dragon that had appeared in the northern mountain area. The young man became slightly nervous. The young man wanted to say that he had already received a reward from the guild, so he did not need anything else, but his mouth was covered by the hand of Mr. Gonzalez, who hastened to interrupt the boy. The man moved as close as possible to the boy and whispered to him that he could not refuse the royal reward under any circumstances, because it could be perceived as a blatant act of disrespect towards the king. The member of the royal guard watched as the owner of the room he had come to and the boy he needed to invite to the palace conversed in front of him. After the tall man's patience began to wear thin, he stared straight at the people standing in front of him. Mr. Gonzalez patted his savior on the shoulder, as if to hint that he should do as he was asked. Field, without thinking twice, replied that he humbly accepted the invitation and would immediately set off for the palace. The building the king was in was so majestic that as soon as someone looked at it, it was clear to whom and for what purpose it belonged. The building was tall with many towers and rooms, because of which it looked like a fortress. It had not been long since the member of the royal guard had found Field Electria, and he had immediately gone with the man to visit the king. When he reached the huge gates where the knights were standing, the boy hesitated a little. The young man did not know how to behave properly, because he did not even think that the ruler of the kingdom of Altia would decide to call him personally to talk about the feat that he had recently accomplished on his own. Next to the king stood his advisor and personal knight, who guarded his highness. A member of the royal guard stood next to the boy opposite the ruler and said that he had carried out the order given, bringing the necessary person to the palace. The tall man introduced Field Electria to the ruler of the kingdom of Altia, although the king himself knew the name of the one he so wanted to see before him. His Majesty was calm and looked at the young man who stood right in front of him. The king's gaze was very penetrating. It seemed that he could see what others could not see, which made it a little scary to just stand there, because the king was so powerful that he could change a lot with one order. Field felt a piercing gaze on him, which made the young man feel a little uneasy. His body shook slightly, and small beads of sweat rolled down his face. The member of the royal guard standing next to him remained steadfastly silent and waited for His Majesty's reaction. However, to the boy's surprise, the king did not show any aggression towards him at all. On the contrary, the ruler of the kingdom of Altia exhaled slightly and said that he was glad to see the very traveler who was able to defeat the red dragon. The boy immediately bowed and replied that it was a great honor for him to meet the king in person for the first time. However, His Majesty asked the boy not to use such formalities and repeated again that Field had recently slain the red dragon. Field knelt down on one knee as the king thanked the new hero for helping the kingdom fight a monster that even seasoned adventurers had trouble battling. The boy didn't understand why everyone was praising him so much because of one dragon. Field was only thinking about how he wanted to eat some tasty meat, while the king ordered his subordinate to first reward the boy and then continue talking to him. The man with the monocle came closer to the boy and brought him a tray with another bag of gold. Field could not believe that he had to accept such a reward even from the king himself, but there were too many coins. Field was not used to accepting so much money, as nothing like this had ever happened to him before, so he said that he could not accept everything that was given to him, as it was too much for him. However, the king insisted on making the hero rich. His Majesty also added that he would like not only to give the young man gold, but also to grant him part of his territory so that Field could become a lord and live near the royal palace. The boy smiled confusedly and rubbed his head, saying that the king was most likely just joking. However, looking at His Majesty's face, the young man realized that the ruler was completely serious in his words. Field paused briefly, trying to find the words to more clearly express his thoughts and feelings. The young man looked at the king and said that he was, of course, very grateful for the offer. However, even if the boy unexpectedly received the territory, he would not be able to manage it properly due to his inexperience. Continuing his thought, the young man added that instead of owning a piece of land, he would prefer to travel and see everything with his own eyes, and also gain experience in his adventures. The king smiled slightly and exhaled, saying that he understood what the boy felt, but he still felt sorry that he could not keep him near the palace. Laughing, His Majesty suggested that the young man simply wanted more territory than the king had offered him. Field was again at a loss, and could only say that the ruler had been too kind and generous. The king also added that if the young man needed any help, he could boldly ask, which would serve as his second reward for not only defeating the dragon, but also helping the entire kingdom. Field thanked the king. After the conversation was over, His Majesty said that he would look forward to the next meeting with the boy. The ruler then asked the captain to escort the young man to the gate, which the member of the royal guard began to do. The king was a little upset that he was unable to keep the young man who had the skill of distributing experience by his side, but he understood that he could not forcibly keep the boy in his kingdom. As he walked further away from the royal palace, Field felt himself still trembling from having to speak personally with the king himself. Field also did not understand why, but His Majesty seemed to him like a cunning old man. However, perhaps something like this should be expected from a person with the highest authority in the kingdom. Carrying a bag filled with money, the boy could not come to terms with the fact that he had received so many awards, because earlier he could not even imagine that he could earn so many gold coins with one feat. The young man understood that with the help of the guild reward and the reward from the king, he could buy absolutely everything he needed, but Field did not know what he wanted, what he would like to spend such money on. Thinking back to the situation that had happened when the boy had asked for the dragon quest, he realized that he needed the appropriate equipment so that no one would doubt that he was indeed a traveler. While Field was thinking about what to buy, he decided to go to Mr. Gonzalez first. At the same time, Lunasis was walking down the street and noticed the guy she had wanted to meet for so long. The girl ran to the young man to stop him, but Field was thinking about buying food, so he did not immediately hear the voice calling him from afar. Having reached the young man, the girl stretched out her hand forward to grab him. Field, not understanding what kind of person was in front of him, was confused. Lunasis blushed slightly because she dreamed of meeting Field, who did not yet know her, but she would soon do everything to change that. A smiling blonde girl with a joyful cry threw herself on Field's neck. She loudly shouts his name. It seems that she knows him. But Field is speechless from shock and absolutely does not understand what is happening. The girl hugs Field tightly and chats happily. She doesn't believe that it's really him, then says that she's wanted to meet him for a long time. Field finds it hard to breathe and his chest is now pressed against the girl's chest. The girl continues to chatter non-stop, saying that she waited for him for a very long time, that she asked the people of the guild where he was and they all answered that he took a rest. Field cried out indignantly, telling her that people were already looking at them. But the girl doesn't listen to him again. She continues to squeeze him and says that she did so much to see Field. Field is confused and still doesn't quite understand what's going on and who this noisy girl is. She finally let him go, but continues to stand next to him, stretching her arms out towards him and smiling broadly. The girl is very beautiful and dressed in an adventurer's outfit. She tells Field how happy she is now about their meeting. Field finally got a good look at her. He hesitated a bit before speaking, and then asked sheepishly if the girl standing in front of him was by any chance called Rusinas. She confirms that her name is indeed Kensei Rusinas and that she is a former adventurer. She asks Mr. Field to simply call her Rusinas, but Field does not remember ever seeing her before. And now Kensei Rusinas is just as joyfully telling Field that she has always admired him, and Field automatically thought that her face was too close to his face, and this was embarrassing him again. Rusinas continues to enthusiastically chirp that doing everything for your guild is exactly what self-sacrifice should be. In her understanding, he is like God. After all, not everyone is brave enough to commit such a magnanimous act. Rusinas continues to say loudly that she understands everything, and that although his merit does not shine brightly and is in the shadows, she always knew that Field's contribution was invaluable. She rushes to hug him again. He tries to fight back, because everyone around is watching. Rusinas began to squeeze Field again, this time by the cheeks. Field repeated her name out loud several times. She, continuing to smile, asked him again what was the matter. Field clarified why she called him master. He then tells Rusinas that he clearly understood her burning desire to meet him, but he is very sorry since he is already finished with that guild. Rusinas did not expect such an answer. She asks Field in surprise why this happened. Field is silent for a while, thinking about what exactly to answer Rusinas to her completely innocent question about his departure from the Dawn of Glory Guild. Finally, he decides to answer. It is not that Field left the guild voluntarily, but the situation forced him to act in this way. He has already accumulated enough experience, so he will cope on his own from now on. This is cruel, Rusinas thinks. Field recalls the unpleasant moment of his expulsion from the Dawn of Glory Guild and his former guildmates who so mercilessly threw him out, considering him unnecessary and useless. Field, sadly, he remembers that, of course, he gave advice to his past fellow adventurers before he was expelled from the guild, but it did not help. The next moment, scratching his head in embarrassment and chuckling nervously, Field tells Rusinas, who is standing next to him, that, to put it briefly, he is now acting on his own. And then he adds that he still has things to do that he should take care of now. These are his plans for the near future. He turned around to leave, but Rusinas immediately called out to him. Grabbing Field by the hands, Rusinas asks him if it is true that he definitely does not want to join any other guild now. Field slightly hesitantly confirms this. He really does not want to do this. Still holding the embarrassed Field's hands, Rusinas tells him that it's wonderful. She seems excited because her hands are shaking slightly. Rusinas, looking into Field's eyes, decisively informs that she has absolutely nothing to do in that adventurer's guild, where Mr. Field will not be. The next moment, all seriousness seemed to fly off her at once, and still holding Field's hands in hers, Rusinas called him by name and decisively suggested that they form a joint team. Field again looked at her in shock and did not know what to say. Kensei Rusinas looks straight at Field, waiting for him to respond to her rather impulsive proposal. She probably means it, although it looks a little strange. And Field is simply very surprised by her request and absolutely does not understand what exactly this noisy but beautiful girl named Rusinas, who attacked him like a bolt from the blue, wants from him. The action moves a little earlier to the guild Dawn of Glory, over the building of which a loud and indignant cry was heard that one of the people of the guild wants to leave Dawn of Glory. This is Rusinas, she's leaving. Guildmaster Claude shouts that he paid a lot of money for her to be in their guild, and if she's wondering what happened in the castle, then everything wasn't as it seems. But she doesn't need anything from the guild if Mr. Field isn't in it. Rusinas apologizes for not telling the leader about this from the beginning, and she will also return the money given to her when signing the contract. She decisively turns around and leaves, and the guild leader unsuccessfully tries to stop her, shouting after her. Guildmaster Claude, in a rage, swears loudly. He, without holding back, hits the table with his fist. Rusinas made him very angry by leaving. Guildmaster Claude doesn't understand what this Mr. Field has to do with it, and that his valuable adventurer Rusinas Kensei just left his famous guild because of some brat with no special abilities. Guildmaster Claude does not understand why this happened, because the boy Field, as Claude thought, was nothing more than a convenient amplifier of the experience they all received. Monk Carl burst into the room. He loudly calls for the head of Claude. It seems that things are bad. Monk Carl shouts something to him about the members of the guild Dawn of Glory. It seems that something is happening downstairs among the rest of the guild members. Guildmaster Claude lets out an indignant cry. Is there really trouble again? One of the guild members asks another what he means by not going. His interlocutor replies that he told him yesterday that he is not going to undertake such a dangerous quest. Guild leader Claude asks them what is going on. An argument is taking place between a pair of adventurers. Then the interlocutors see the head of the guild, Claude, who has come down. One of them clicks his tongue disapprovingly, and the second hesitantly calls the head by name, waiting for his reaction. And then one of them suddenly shouts that boss Claude himself once told them about this, namely that if they join his guild Dawn of Glory, they will be as strong as they want. Claude begins to worry. The guild members continue to shout that this was certainly the case before, but recently many quests have failed, even those that they had previously completed so easily, and some who should have had high combat qualifications ended up dying. The guild members say that depending on what happens next, they will all decide whether to leave this guild or not. The sorceress Dorothy hesitantly asks if they are joking when they say such things now. They ask her in response if their wounds and injuries really look like a joke, since many of the members of the Dawn of Glory Guild gathered here are wounded, and this does not improve their mood. One of the guild members says that he just saw the holy swordswoman leave the guild. She must have given up too. And probably the reason for all this is their guild leader Claude. Claude at this time tries to say something but can't. To Claude's horror, many members of the Dawn of Glory Guild began to realize that ever since the inconspicuous boy Field left them, very strange things had been happening in their once popular and powerful guild. The guild members are dissatisfied because they all thought that they had made good progress, because the guild leader Claude told them that joining his guild Dawn of Glory would definitely help them improve their abilities. But now they don't believe it. They remember that the guild leader Claude even told them all that this useless boy Field was only slowing them down, But at the same time, he always left the most difficult tasks to this field. Claude is numb and silently listens to the accusations. Claude is shocked by the behavior of his comrades. The members of the guild Dawn of Glory gathered in front of him are clearly indignant. They curse without holding back and ask where the head of their guild, Claude, stuck this inconspicuous guy Field. The action moves to another room, perhaps a library or another guild, and there someone asks those present about the location of the elven country, thereby causing exclamations of surprise from the visitors. The girl administrator behind the counter, smiling deliberately sweetly, tells the applicant that she is very far from such legends and knows nothing about them. But perhaps someone else is aware of what is happening. And one of the impressive-looking local adventurers answered doubtfully that his great-grandmother had once said something like that. But apparently because she had gone mad in her old age, each of her such stories always turned to goblins. Local children are also surprised by questions about the country of elves. They don't even know about such things. They ask someone with smiles how it is possible that such an adult still believes in some kind of fairy tale elves. And then one of those present, laughing awkwardly and making a rather strange face, joked that yesterday they had mushroom stew on their menu, and now finally everything became clear to him. Gloomy Field, who had shown interest in the elves, frowned because he had not come any closer to his goal. He had learned nothing about the country of the elves and the path to it. He seems tired of searching for the necessary information. Standing in front of the bookcase and looking at many different books, he thoughtfully chuckles and suggests that information about elves is probably a great rarity here. In fact, he himself only knows about them from those books that he read avidly a long time ago, when he was still a child. In the books he had read earlier, it was said that elves were some kind of mysterious race that never appeared in crowded places. Field reaches out to the shelf and pulls out another book to search for the necessary information. He does not give up. Field's next goal is a journey to the country of elves, and he intends to achieve it. But this was only spoken of in all sorts of old literature and fairy tales. Field thinks that even if elves do not really exist, it is not surprising that some race could be related to them. Someone came up close to him from behind, and then suddenly Kensei Rusuna's voice was heard in Field's ear. She conspiratorially asked what Field was interested in here, perhaps the elves. For a moment Field was taken aback by surprise and amazement. She had clearly caught him off guard. Field screamed loudly, and realizing that it was Rusuna's again, he called her by name and in a furious whisper asked her to behave a little more quietly in the library. She responded with a meaningful silence. Field, in a loud whisper, wondered what she was doing here, to which Rusuna's replied that she had already said earlier that she really wanted to create a team with Mr. Field. And Field in response reminded her that he had refused this offer back then. He again resolutely refuses to do something like that with her. Rusuna's argues with him and asks him not to be such a bore. Then, to change the subject, Field asks about her work at the Dawn of Glory Guild and whether Rusuna's is sure she really wants to be here with him. She looks at him for a few moments, uncomprehending. Then Rusuna's answered him without hesitation that it was not a problem, because she had already quit the guild Dawn of Glory. Field was in complete shock. His eyes wide, stuttering, he yelled at her that she really just went and quit. Field and Rusuna's annoying chatter is clearly beginning to irritate the other library patrons. One of them growls angrily and lets out indignant words in their direction. Field and Rusuna's notice this and shudder together. Meanwhile, Rusuna's tells him that she only got a job in that guild, Dawn of Glory, because she was following Mr. Field. She asks him nonchalantly, so what is the book Field is holding in his hands about? Field reluctantly tells her that he is trying to find a way to the land of the elves. He immediately clarifies to her that he knows that these are all just fairy tales. But the thrill of adventure lies in finding something that no one has ever found before. Rusuna's again insists that she and Mr. Field need to form a team. Field thinks that this is a psychic attack. Rusuna's disagrees. She wants to tell what she has heard over the past few days. The library visitors are angry. These two are really bothering them. Covering her face with her hand and winking slightly, Kensei Rusuna's tells Field in a conspiratorial voice that, in fact, she knows exactly how he can get to the land of the elves. Tired of the noise produced by Field and Rusuna's incessant chatter, was heard throughout the library building. With a shout that they needed to be more quiet in the library, the surprised Field and Rusuna's were abruptly thrown out of the library doors, obviously for disturbing the peace of the other visitors when they were arguing so furiously. Field sadly stated that he and Rusuna's were thrown out of the library. Rusuna's sighed and reproachfully said that Mr. Field should not have behaved like that in the library and started shouting for no reason at all. And then Field suddenly grabbed the surprised Rusuna's by the shoulders and shouted loudly, asking her if she really was there, that very country of elves, probably referring to Rusuna's words that she knew the way there. Rusena's froze in surprise and remained silent. Field looks at Rusena's tensely, waiting for her answer and again names the country of the elves. Having overcome her surprise, Rusena smiles slyly. It seems that now she has the opportunity to influence Mr. Field. Pretending to be lost in thought, Rusena says that she doesn't know what to do, but if they go together then perhaps she will show him the way to the land of the elves. Field begins to boil at her words. He chuckles irritably, trying to restrain himself. At this time, Field is in a fierce battle with himself and his thoughts. He experiences a lot of emotions from anger to despair and tries to find the most appropriate words for this situation. Finally, Field spoke. All the thinking didn't take him very long, but he clearly and calmly informed Rusenas, who was standing in front of him, that he understood everything. She looked at him questioningly. What had he decided for himself? He decisively declares to the satisfied Rusenas that they will go to the land of the elves together. But it will be only a temporary union and only until they get there. And so that she does not invent anything unnecessary about their joint expedition. Rusenas rejoices and shouts that he will be with Mr. Field. He shouts, reminding her that this is all temporary. This will be their temporary agreement. She urges him on because they need to prepare for the campaign. Field is not sure that she even barely hears him. A joyfully smiling Kensei, Rusenas walks next to Mr. Field, whom she has been looking for so long, and Field again looks very embarrassed. Which is not surprising, because Rusenas is a very beautiful girl. The action moves to the guild Dawn of Glory, where the head of the guild, Claude, in great shock, tensely asks someone what he wants to say. Are they really permanently banning any activity of the guild Dawn of Glory? A gloomy man in uniform dispassionately informs the head of the guild, Claude, that he has an official document in his hands, and it is written in black and white that any activity on behalf of the guild Dawn of Glory is now prohibited. The gloomy man added that His Majesty was very concerned about the situation that had arisen after those words of the guild leader Claude. That is why His Majesty ordered his people to deal with the violators who were defaming his name. At the end of the conversation, the gloomy man told the head of the guild, Claude, that when the situation is resolved, they will all be able to return to their business. That's all he has. Claude desperately shouts after him and asks him to wait. He does not believe in what is happening. Claude asks the gloomy man what they should do now. He doesn't know, because even if they can survive this collapse, their resources are not infinite. But this does not concern the gloomy man. For him, the word of His Majesty is law, which he reports. The gloomy man also added threateningly that if any illegal activity emanating from the Dawn of Glory Guild were to surface, the sanctions imposed would be even stricter. Perhaps the entire guild would even be dissolved. As he left, the gloomy man said that no one was stopping them from acting separately. If the only issue was making ends meet, then the capital was short of janitors and they could help with distributing rations, which would greatly help their country. The gloomy man says goodbye and leaves, leaving Guild Master Claude in silent shock, pondering what he had just said. Guild Leader Claude is very angry. He throws something at the door, fragments fly in all directions. Claude loudly curses after the gloomy man who left. He does not understand why they are doing this and whether they are really mocking him and his guild in this way. Claude, in a frenzy, shouts loudly that Dawn of Glory is the best guild in the kingdom. Let it be known to all. In a rage, the guild leader Claude continues to yell that in fact, in this way they themselves are shooting themselves in the foot. Claude curses continuously. He does not understand how it all happened. They kicked out the useless Field and hired a holy sword. This should have been just the beginning, but something went wrong. The sorceress Dorothy and the monk Carl ask him to calm down. Everything was done for this. Guildmaster Claude, not paying attention to where he was, fell to his knees without strength, next to his companions, the sorceress Dorothy and the monk Carl, and other members of the Dawn of Glory Guild crowded around in anticipation. The members of the Dawn of Glory Guild, having gathered in a large crowd in the hall, inform the head of the guild, Claude, that they just heard his entire conversation with the gloomy man. Their faces express misunderstanding and confusion. They clearly did not expect such a statement. Claude thinks that it is possible to start all over again. He still has friends. He apologizes out loud to all the adventurers for his miserable appearance. He assures them that everything will be fine. He understands that it is very difficult, but they must endure. Guildmaster Claude, fiddling with the buckle on his cloak, tore it off with an awkward movement of his hand, and it fell to the floor with a loud clang. One of the adventurers rather rudely tells the guild leader Claude that no normal adventurer would need an inactive guild for nothing, and that he is going to find himself another guild. An adventurer does not risk more than necessary. Claude must understand this. They take turns saying goodbye to Claude, saying that it is not they who are like this, but life itself. Someone wishes him to visit and is grateful for everything he has done for him. Claude mumbles something. Suddenly Bonsa attacks one of his former comrades, shouting and calling them dirty names. Are they all making fun of him, since the Dawn of Glory Guild has been feeding them for so many years, and is this really their gratitude? Monk Carl tries in vain to stop Bonsa. And then the self-confident warrior Bonsa suddenly receives a powerful blow to the jaw from the departing adventurer. Bonsa is in shock. He clearly did not expect that he would be knocked out so easily with one blow. Bonsa flies towards the window and hits the wall with a loud bang. The blow from the adventurer who just talked about changing guilds was really very strong, since it threw the healthy Bonsa so far. But the man who hit him calmly waves his hand to everyone who remained in the hall. He indifferently says goodbye to the former guild leader Claude and leaves the Dawn of Glory Guild. The head of the guild, Claude, fell into a stupor and silently watched the man leave, and the monk Carl rushed forward. He asked if everything was okay with Mr. Bones, and he was also very surprised at how it happened that he was quickly knocked out with just one blow. The former great warrior Bonsa now looks rather pitiful. Real streams of tears are running from his eyes, and his face is distorted from the blow. He loudly screams that it hurts. It seems that Bonsa is in shock from what happened, because no one has ever hit him with such blows without any reason, and now it seems to him that this is not right, it is wrong. He continues to scream and cry, mentioning his mother in passing. Monk Carl, wanting to calm the sobbing former warrior Bonsu, is going to fix everything with the help of his medical skills. He makes certain passes with his hands, waiting for his skill to work. And then Monk Carl also starts screaming because his magic powers don't work and Bonsa's wounds don't heal at all. Guildmaster Claude is still in a daze. He understands that they are falling apart. Monk Carl hesitantly calls out his name. Monk Carl in tears tells the head of the guild Claude that his healing magic, or rather all his magical powers, have completely disappeared. Monk Carl is in shock, his eyes are full of tears, and he does not understand what happened and why it happened. He has no more strength. Guildmaster Claude is horrified. He screams loudly in his mind and realizes that his guild Dawn of Glory has just collapsed, and he absolutely does not understand why such a terrible event happened. The action moves to Field, who somewhere on the way to the land of elves confidently fights huge monsters resembling wolves, and does not even remember his former colleagues in the guild Dawn of Glory. Field, in the middle of the forest, had just been in a fierce battle with large wolves, and finally he stopped and was glaring menacingly in their direction, and they, seeing this, began to shake with fear. Not wanting to become Field's prey, the wolves run away with loud barking. They do not want to attack him anymore and just want to save their lives. Field snorted contemptuously in the direction of his fleeing opponents, and matter-of-factly stated that the beasts that attacked him were fighting wolves. He is very surprised. Raising his head up, he asks, "Is it really true that the country of elves is somewhere in such a wilderness, because there is not even a road here? And how did Rusinas find out about this?" Probably referring to her knowledge of the road to the country of elves. He remembers her chatter on the hike. She lectures him about how one should not underestimate battle wolves and the great battle wolf. He is a loner and he is very tenacious. She was delighted when they found a spring and offered to wash together, but he refused. During their journey together to the land of the elves, Field had the feeling that Rusinas had known about the land of the elves a long time ago. Suddenly, he heard something from the forest thicket and pricked up his ears. Field clearly hears something from the direction of the spring where Rusinas is bathing. He immediately turns his head in the direction of the noise and goes there to check. Rusinas appeared before Field, who, not suspecting anything, continued to swim. Things are bad, Field thinks, because the weapon of the bathing Kensei Rusinas remained on the shore. Field is going to protect her. He began to pull out his sword and at the same time loudly calls her name and also shouts, warning that one of the battle wolves is moving straight towards her. And then Rusinas turned to face the danger. Her face did not show a shadow of fear. She took a fighting stance and prepared to repel the attack of the battle wolf. Rusinas, without hesitation, hits the attacking warwolf with one of her fighting skills, clearly and powerfully. The force of the blow ripples around her, and the wolf, his eyes wide, gasps at how powerful her blow was. Field is shocked, his eyes wide, silently watching Rusinas from behind a tree trunk. He clearly did not expect that a naked girl would be able to deliver such a devastating blow with her bare hands to a huge fighting wolf, who had flown away from Rusinas's blow, stands a little further away and looks at her. He is still in shock and clearly does not understand what to do next, since his usual prey has never behaved so brazenly. Rusinas looks gloomily at the work of his hands and asks the fighting wolf she just discarded if the dog wants to play with her some more. The battle wolf, who had clearly never lost an attack before, was disappointed and almost cried with frustration. The wolf runs away, and Rusinas, seeing Field, immediately greets him joyfully and without any embarrassment, asking if Mr. Field has decided to keep her company. Field is embarrassed. He does not want to swim. He came because he thought that she was in danger. Rusinas is flattered by his concern and is very pleased. She says that this is what happened. And she is also pleased that Mr. Field was so worried about her. She giggles sweetly, as she thought, Mr. Field really is a very kind person. Rusinas again invites Field to join her in swimming, or maybe Field is not attracted to her body, so he does not want to. She added that if the other girls heard his words about saving, they would definitely pounce on him. But she really isn't very confident in herself. Field timidly assures her that she is very beautiful. Rusinas immediately rejoices and calls him to her again, not realizing that he is standing there. In response, Field indignantly shouts at her to finally cover herself with something. Rusinas and Field, after the incident with the battle wolves, continue their journey to the land of the elves, and she tells him that very soon they will reach an area called the Maze of Fog. Field asked again about the Maze of Fog. Rusinas confirmed. Few people can even just find the entrance to this labyrinth, and only a few are able to go through the labyrinth itself. Field, walking behind Rusinas, makes a distrustful face. He obviously doesn't really believe what Rusinas just told him about the supposedly dangerous place called the Maze of Fog. Rusinas continues to tell him about what awaits them further, and then, right behind this labyrinth is the land of the elves. Field wanted to say something in response but changed his mind. Finally, Field, walking slightly behind Rusinas, decided to talk to her about what was troubling him. He thoughtfully called out her name. Looking at Field attentively and unusually seriously, Rusinas waits for what he wants to ask. Then he asks Rusinas to tell him where and why she knows so much about the country of the elves. But these are not all of Field's questions. For example, he does not understand why, from their very first meeting, she was so suspiciously kind to him. Field continues to speak. He asks if she doesn't find this funny. It seems to Field that she is not at all one of those people who can become attached to a person just because he is not selfish. And then something unexpected happened. They were distracted and did not notice the danger. Field was very surprised, but could it really be that the person who had just come out of the forest thicket to meet them was none other than the one Rusinas had told him about a little earlier? A huge, scarred monster with glowing eyes bared its fangs at the sight of the travelers. The monster does not hesitate. It rushes to attack the people standing in its path, clearly intending to make them its rightful prey. Field recognized the monster. He shouts loudly to her that it is a great war wolf. Rusinas grabs his weapon, preparing to meet the danger. The great war wolf growls and quickly flies to attack Rusinas, who has taken a fighting stance and readied her weapon. Field, also prepared for battle, shouts to Rusinas, who is standing in front, to hold on. But she clearly and without hesitation denies his offer. Without turning around, she asks Mr. Field to move away because she sees that it is a huge fighting wolf. But Rusinas confidently declares that this battle wolf is definitely not her rival. She smiles contentedly and looks straight ahead at the approaching enemy. The great war wolf's toothy mouth met the swing of Rusinas' sword in an instant in an attacking blow. And then Rusinas changes position and with a powerful blow of his sword, deftly repels the attack of the great battle wolf, which is many times larger than her. The sword of Rusinas completed its lightning-fast movement, and the great battle wolf, without realizing it, was defeated and thrown back by the force of her blow. Field watches her amazing actions in shock. He is impressed. Rusinas hesitates for a moment, and then she wants to say something to Mr. Field. Rusinas wants to continue the speech she started. It seems that she has gathered courage to tell Mr. Field something very important to her. But then, with a sudden lunge, Field silently struck down the great war wolf, who had reappeared as if out of nowhere right behind Rusinas, and who was clearly intending to attack her from behind. She fell silent, stunned. Field puts away his weapon, and, as if nothing had happened, grumpily reminds the surprised Rusinas that she herself had recently told him to beware of these great war wolves. Field asks her to forget what he just said about her attitude towards him. He understands that she has her reasons for this, and if she does not want to tell him about them now, then that is her right. He went a little too far and asks for forgiveness for this. Rusinas tells Mr. Field, unusually quietly, that when the time comes, she promises that she will definitely tell him everything about herself. She addresses him by name and says that she wants Mr. Field to know the real her. Field looks at her carefully, because now he has been told something important. She suggests that he move on, because from here begins the Maze of Fog. And if he doesn't mind, then let him take her hand and never let her go. Having finished speaking, Rusinas silently went on, and then Field still didn't understand why. The land of elves that Field was looking for was just around the corner. When the time came, Field had a feeling that this time would come very soon. Rusinas asks Mr. Field to come a little closer and a little closer. But to the embarrassed and irritated Field, it seems that she is already too close to him. Rusinas giggles. It seems she enjoys teasing him. In the Maze of Fog, you can't even see the faces of the people walking hand in hand with you, so it would be very bad if he got lost. Field partly agrees with her words, but he orients himself roughly by the sound of her voice, and she just needs an excuse to stick around. Here Field cried out sharply. In this fog he was unable to adequately assess the dangers of the route. Field stumbled and almost fell into the pit, but Rusinas kept him close, holding his hands tightly, asking him to be careful because there are traps all around. She asks if they agreed to be careful in this dangerous place. Field agrees. Rusinas continues to lead him through the darkness. And now finally she announces that they have arrived and that the goal of their journey has been reached. However, Field does not see anything. He walks and makes a distrustful face. And suddenly Field's face seemed to be illuminated by a bright light. He opened his eyes in surprise and with his mouth open, looked at something that appeared in front of him. The darkness of the labyrinth ended and a stunning picture appeared before his eyes. Field saw a stunning panorama. It is a beautiful city among dense forests and mountain slopes. Rusinas looks at the city spread out before them with a smile. She welcomes Mr. Field to the land of the elves. The incredibly beautiful city, located right at the powerful roots of a giant tree, brought Field into complete delight. And he, with his mouth open, contemplated the beauty that opened up to him, obviously trying to see as much as possible. And suddenly he starts off somewhere and runs, without saying anything to Rusinas. She screamed in surprise and shouted, asking where Mr. Field had rushed off to. Field jumped hastily from the small rock ledge, on which he and Rusinas had been standing and landed with his feet on the soft grass. Field cries out in delight, his face expressing childish happiness and delight, and Rusinas silently watches his delight. Field spread his arms as if trying to embrace this incredibly beautiful view and the expanse that he was observing. It was amazing, and he had never seen anything as beautiful as this place before. He is very grateful to Rusinas for bringing him here to the land of the elves. Rusinas is embarrassed, but she smiles contentedly and thinks that he has absolutely nothing to thank her for. And then she had to thank him somehow. Maybe at the same time she and Mr. Field could create their own team. Field immediately refused her offer again, telling her not to even think about it. Then she offers him to kiss her as a reward for his efforts. She would be very happy about that. Field, to her regret, again refuses the proposed option. At this time, someone is quietly watching them from the thick grass. Rusinas is pouting. She is sure that he has nothing to lose, and in general, it is very exciting. She pulls him towards her. Field screams that he does not understand what came over her and that she will drive him to a nervous breakdown. He screams and asks her to stop. Rusinas and Field, who were routinely arguing and messing around, suddenly fell on the grass. Rusinas was still trying to kiss him, and Field was making terrible faces. And then from the tall grass with cries of delight appeared cute elven children. They smiled radiantly and greeted Miss Rusinas. They knew that it was she. The children were clearly happy to see her. The children have pointy ears and light hair. Rusinas immediately detached herself from the astonished Field and greeted them joyfully, calling them by name. The children's names are Danon and Sana, and she hasn't seen them for a long time. She asks how they are doing, how they are getting on here. Field watches their conversation in amazement. The elven children Danon and Sana are mutually polite and also ask how Miss Rusinas is doing, if everything is okay with her. She in response claims that naturally everything is okay with her, because it couldn't be any other way. Danon and Sana saw Field and asked who came with her. Could it be her boyfriend? Field puffs indignantly. He denies everything because they are not in such a relationship at all. Rusinas answered the children that it was just her friend. The children are surprised. And then Field, looking at Rusinas and the children, said out loud that he thought so, because it was obvious that Rusinas was not just familiar with the elven children. Yes, Rusinas also thinks that Mr. Field has already understood everything a long time ago. So there is no point in hiding anything any longer. Field silently looks at her. Rusinas will fulfill her promise given to Mr. Field on the way to the land of the elves. She took out earrings from her earlobes, and suddenly her ears instantly changed shape, becoming pointed and long like all the other elves of this country, just like the children they had just met. Rusinas smiles sweetly and looks straight at Field. She still holds the earrings in her hands. Slightly hesitantly she tells Field that she is an elf. The elven children Danon and Sana swarmed over Field, feeling him up because he was a human and they hadn't seen many of them. Field was shocked, but he knew it was true. A beautiful city awaits them. It attracts attention with its neat houses, arches, and many stairs. The whole company moves through the city. They are greeted by the locals. Field carries one of the elven children on his shoulders and sighs in amazement. Looking around, Rusinas confidently leads them along a familiar route. Field lets out another exclamation of admiration as he watches the daily life of the townspeople, seeing how they go about their chores around their homes. Field looks at the people he meets with wide eyes because everyone here has such long ears. One of the elf children continues to sit on his shoulders. He enthusiastically feels Field's ears. And Field also noticed something while he was looking at all the elves he met along the way. He was trying to formulate his thoughts and choose the words. Finally, he realized what seemed unusual to him was that both the men and women of this country looked very well groomed. Field was amazed. And when he realized this fully, now Field understands that he feels out of place. And then, looking at Rusinas, he seems to have guessed something. One of the elven children, still sitting on his shoulders, asks what's wrong with his brother Field. He looks away thoughtfully. Next to Field there is a second elf child. He also looks at Field, waiting for him to answer. The children are very beautiful. And the thoughtful Field, as if continuing to talk to himself out loud, reports that he has finally become convinced of something. The elven children Danon and Sana do not understand what he is talking about. Looking at the beautiful city through which they were still walking, Field thought about Rusinas and who she really was. Suddenly Field announces that it appears Rusinas's level has gone up a bit. She lets out a startled cry and turns to face Field, her face expressing extreme surprise, even shock. Clearly she had not expected such a statement. She asks how Field knows this and immediately thinks that this is why it seems to her that her body has become lighter. She understood everything, but it is not every day that you meet a person who knows analysis. And he is also in the same group, albeit temporary, with Rusinas. Field thinks that during the trip here they received increased experience. Rusinas is happy. She already thought that she would not become stronger. She thanks Mr. Field. Danon and Sana do not understand what the Sword Maiden is talking about because she is already more than strong. But Rusinas suddenly says in a serious tone in response to Danon and Sana's delight that no, that's not true. Field froze and stared at her in confusion, trying to understand. Rusinas continues to say that she believes that for now the level that she has is still not enough. She needs to be even stronger. And then Field suddenly begins to hear the inhabitants of the city coughing around him on all sides. He looks around thoughtfully, looking warily at those around him. And behind them and to the side and upon closer inspection in the windows, it is clear that the local residents are not healthy. He turns to Rusinas with a question. Mr. Field thinks that something is wrong here in the city. He asks if she has the same feeling. One of the elven children immediately agrees with him because they are sure that Brother Field is absolutely right. Danon and Sana say that there is some kind of magic forest power or something like that around them, and it seems to be depleting. That is why all the adults in the city have been running around like crazy lately. Danon and Sana continue to talk. They think that it is very bad and it was such that even Illumina herself lost consciousness. Rusinas, in shock, asks again, is it really possible that even Illumina is sick? Field, surprised, asks the children for information again. He does not understand who Illumina is, and Rusinas replies that Illumina is her sister. Rusinas clenched her fists. She thinks that her sister understands magic much better than her, and that she is the best person that Rusinas knows. And she is so proud of her. Rusinas hesitantly asks Mr. Field for forgiveness, but she needs to go to her sister now. Field sighs in embarrassment, scratches the back of his head, and sighing asks Rusinas where her sister Illumina is. Rusinas is very surprised. Does Mr. Field really want to go with them? Field retorts that it is obvious that they are all worried about Illumina. And then, he feels that he owes a great debt to Rusinas for bringing him here, and going with them to Illumina is the least he can do now. And Field also reminds Rusinas that he is a stranger here, and since that is the case, he cannot be left alone in the City of Elves. Rusinas is amazed. She wants to say something to Mr. Field but falls silent. Danon and Sana Mola listen to them. And then the elven children Danon and Sana ask Field if he is definitely not their sister Rusina's boyfriend. Field immediately vehemently denies all this, because he already told them that he is not Rusina's boyfriend. Danon and Sana both tell Field that they are very sorry that this is not the case. Rusinas is surprised by their chatter and is about to say something. She was trying to calm down their chatter about Field possibly being her boyfriend, but then she suddenly became embarrassed and laughed at her own thoughts. Rusinas sighed, closed her eyes slightly, and dreamily agreed with Danon and Sana. She really was very sorry that Mr. Field was not her boyfriend. Rusinas and Field with the children reached their destination. It was obviously some important building. There was a guard at the entrance. This is a castle. Near the castle gates, the Princess Rusinas is greeted by an elf guard. He is very surprised by her appearance, but at the same time he is glad that she has finally returned. He asks her to wait a little and asks who this man is who is coming to the palace with her. Rusinas replies that he is her lover, and Field immediately corrects her that he is just an acquaintance. Rusinas informs the guards that Field is her guest and asks them to behave accordingly. The serious Rusinas asks Mr. Field's forgiveness in advance for the fact that something unsightly is about to appear before his eyes. Field is a little scared of what is about to happen to them in this place. Rusinas and Field entered a huge hall, on the walls of which hang large canvases covered with some strange formulas, many of which are crossed out with bold crosses. Upon entering, Rusinas greets His Majesty. She then reports that Rusina's Kensei has returned to the land of the elves. From all sides, the voices of the courtiers are heard, whispering and repeating her name out loud several times. Field is silent and watches what is happening in amazement. It is obvious that he has never been in such places before. So far, no one present has responded to Rusinas. The scratching of a pen is heard, and an important elf, who is probably the king, writing something on the canvases, is discontentedly distracted and asks if it is true that Rusinas has returned. The king's heavy gaze is directed straight at Rusinas and Field, who have entered the hall. Quickly approaching those who entered, His Majesty unexpectedly rewarded Rusinas with a sweeping slap. Rusinas silently endured the blow. Although it was very strong, it seems that she expected such a turn of events and did not react in any way. His Majesty becomes very angry and loudly asks why she returned to the land of the elves now. Rusinas became sad, her cheek turned red from the king's blow. She was silent and looked at her feet, not daring to answer His Majesty's question. He reproaches her because she is a princess, but even being one, she still dumped all her responsibilities on her sister Illumina, because of which she fell ill. Rusinas trembles, barely holding back the urge to answer. Finally, she shouts back that she sincerely apologizes for all the trouble she has caused with her actions. But His Majesty doesn't really listen and shouts that her apologies mean nothing to him. Rusinas tries to justify himself and shouts in response that their country will have no future if they continue to rely only on their own wisdom. The situation has long been out of control, and it is obvious that they cannot cope on their own. Rusinas continues to say that she is sure that His Majesty understands all this anyway. His Majesty makes a displeased noise. It is obvious that the king has become even more angry. He looks at her angrily and asks in a sinister voice that Rusinas must have found a way to solve all their problems, since she is so bold in throwing around such loud words. Standing before the king, who is waiting for her to answer his question, Rusinas hesitantly tries to begin a speech, but she cannot find the words. Her hands are shaking slightly. His Majesty, meanwhile, continues to accuse her, ordering her not to be so vain. Despite the fact that she speaks such bold words, he believes that she herself has done nothing. His Majesty also accuses Princess Rusinas of putting the lives of her fellow tribesmen at risk, and of bringing a stranger here to them. Rusinas again only listens to his reproaches in silence. His Majesty also does not understand who this man is. Has Rusinas really found herself a husband? Field is displeased, but before the surprised Field can answer the king's attack, Rusinas gestures for him to be silent. She hesitated a little before answering, and then resolutely told His Majesty that Mr. Field was her close friend and nothing more. Therefore, she asks His Majesty to stop such statements. She has had enough of them. Surprised by her actions, Field stands a little behind and watches the conversation. His Majesty chuckled thoughtfully, but he agreed with her statement. Having put his writing utensils on the table, the king clearly became interested in the man. His Majesty turns to Field and asks what the man thought when he found himself in their country. Field, after a slight hesitation, replies that at first the country seemed beautiful and mysterious to him, but there was something wrong with it and its inhabitants. Field noticed that there was something wrong with the physical condition of the elves of this country. He asked His Majesty if there was a reason for all this. He answered that everything was correct. There was an acute shortage of magical power in their country. His Majesty replies that, as Field might have noticed earlier, their elven country is surrounded on all sides by dense forests, and therefore their magic is closely connected with them. Elves get life force from forests, and having collected enough force, elves have children who after a while return force to forest. And thus force constantly flows, but now this reasonable process is broken. The land of the elves lost many of their tribesmen, fighting in constant battles with various enemies of their race, and so the worst happened. His Majesty gloomily stated that the result of all the wars was that the strength of the forests surrounding them was gradually waning. The magical power of the forests has become less, therefore the life force of the elves has become less, and they can no longer return the magical power back. Elves have a long life but a low birth rate. They cannot just increase the population. Therefore, those elves who still have quite a lot of magical power in reserve support the forest by transferring their power to the forest. This is exactly the situation in the country of the elves now. His Majesty, pointing to Rusinas, recalls that initially this duty of maintaining the strength of the forests was placed on the shoulders of Princess Rusinas, and when she secretly left the country, it was taken over by her sister, Illumina. His Majesty turns to Rusinas, who stands silently before him. He wants to ask her the question that torments him once again. Towering menacingly over his interlocutors, His Majesty loudly asks Rusinas why she left her country of elves and abandoned her sister. Suddenly turns to Field, causing him to flinch, obviously the king's anger making him indecisive. His Majesty unexpectedly thanks the man standing before him for returning Rusinas to the land of the elves. Pointing to Rusinas, he tells Field that out of respect for his daughter, he will allow Field to stay in the elf country for a couple of days. His Majesty is still angry. He orders Rusinas to come closer. He believes that since she is here, now she must fulfill her duty. The duty that she forced her sister to fulfill. Rusinas meekly stepped forward towards the king and Field shouted at her and tried to say something. But Rusinas immediately interrupted him. She said that she was very grateful to Mr. Field for being with her all this time. Rusinas decides to tell him everything. She hesitates a little, but then tells him that in fact she was trying to take advantage of his power. It turns out that she had known for a long time how badly his previous guild, Dawn of Glory, had treated him. And when she heard that he was looking for the country of the elves, she decided that she had finally got her chance. Rusinas is upset she was so stupid. Bowing her head now, she is very sorry for what she did because she tried to deceive him. And in the end, she's nothing but trouble. Rusinas tries not to cry, but she can't stop her hands from shaking. Without turning to her interlocutor, she says that she is truly very sorry that she could not show Mr. Field how beautiful her elven country is. Field mechanically began to stretch his hand towards Rusinas, and then suddenly Field could not restrain himself and suddenly grabbed the hand of the departing Rusinas, trying to keep her close to him. She shuddered in surprise. Field's face changed greatly. He rather emotionally tells her that she should not sacrifice herself even if it is a question of fulfilling her duty to the country. Rusinas opened her eyes wide in surprise and with her mouth open, looked at Field, who had so abruptly begun to defend her, while His Majesty, standing nearby, silently watched the developments. In front of the astonished Rusinas and the displeased-looking king of the elves, Field shouts loudly and decisively. He wants to say something. Ignoring the angry look from the king, Field hits himself in the chest with his fist and shouts that he intends to save the country of Rusinas with his power. Field informs Rusinas and His Majesty that his ability is to increase the experience his teammates receive. And since this extra experience belongs to Field, he can distribute it as he wishes. He understands that the main problem of the country of elves is that the inhabitants of the country lack the magical power to maintain the health of the forest. And if this is so, then Field has come up with something. Namely, Field tells Rusinas and the king that he plans to make the inhabitants of the elven country stronger, with the help of his magical ability to distribute experience. Field believes that then the magical power of each individual elf will grow, and therefore, they will be able to support the life of the forest in return. Field clarifies whether he understood everything correctly. His Majesty listens attentively and considers this plan incredible. His Majesty is surprised that this man, Field, is not only able to increase the experience he and his comrades receive, but he can also distribute it at his own discretion among the rest of the team. Field is agitated. He squeezes his hand impatiently. He also understands that His Majesty may not believe him. The king is amazed that this man, Field, is now here and asking for a chance to help the country of the elves. Field is very determined. Looking at His Majesty, he again boldly asks to give him the ability to save the country of the elves, which he so wanted to get to. The quiet corridors of the castle. Rusinas, standing by the bed in his sister's chambers, quietly looks at the person lying there. It's Illumina. She's breathing heavily. She's in a daze and doesn't realize that her sister is standing next to her. Sad Rusinas quietly calls Illumina by name and strokes her head, but her sister does not hear her. Something distracted Rusinas' attention. Suddenly Rusinas saw that Mr. Field was standing in the doorway of the chambers and watching her as if he wanted to say something. Coming out into the corridor, they stopped with Princess Rusinas and started talking, standing at the balcony railing. Field asks if it is true that he can now continue to live in the castle. Rusinas confirms this fact and asks if he is embarrassed by this. Field told her that recently he met a tall woman in the castle and she looked at him so unusually. Rusinas replied that if she was tall, then most likely it was her mother. Field cried out in amazement, could it really be Rusinas' mother? He thinks with embarrassment that you can't tell how old elves really are by looking at them. And Rusinas explains to him that people are simply not frequent guests in their area. Rusinas is worried. She rubs her hands and asks Mr. Field for forgiveness for all the inconvenience caused. After all, she left the land of the elves to find a solution to their problems somewhere far away, not only beyond its borders, but also beyond the boundaries of their elven knowledge. For a long time, she tirelessly searched and searched for answers in different places, from different people, in different books, day after day, without rest. Rusinus then tells Field that one day there came a moment when she was simply tired of looking for answers. But Field's ability immediately attracted Rusinus's attention, so she came up with a plan that would allow her to get closer to him, and here they are in the land of the elves. Field clarifies whether this was the only thing. Rusinus hesitates with a final answer. She, sighing heavily, says that she acted very stupidly trying to use him, but even so, she does not understand why Mr. Field ultimately decided to help the inhabitants of the elven country. Field looks at her in confusion and thinks about what to answer. Field simply replies that he himself doesn't really know why he did it, just like that. Although if she needs a reason, she can assume that he did it in gratitude for her bringing him here. She clarifies if that's all, he confirms. Confused, Field thinks that it would be sad if such a beautiful country of elves simply disappeared. He himself is not sure of his words, but continues to speak. Field understands that country and family are very important, especially if they have spent so many years together. Besides, if his teammate is in trouble, he can't just turn a blind eye to it. To change the subject and overcome his embarrassment in front of the girl, Field sums up that he is, in fact, an adventurer and not just anyone. Rusinus blushes sweetly and smiles. Rusinus is pleased, but at the same time she believes that it is because of this way of thinking that Field is constantly being used. Field shushes her, because he was just trying to tell her something kind, and she is ruining everything for him. Rusinus and Field continue their usual fuss and squabble. It seems they have become very close friends. Their joy was interrupted by the sudden appearance of His Majesty next to them, who coldly addressed the man without even calling him by name. His Majesty, still looking menacingly at Field, expressed his desire to immediately speak with the man face to face. Field felt uncomfortable, because they had already gone so deep into the bowels of the castle, and Field did not yet understand why His Majesty needed him. Suddenly, His Majesty, without looking at the man, states that Field's sword seemed to have reached its limit. Field mechanically grabbed the scabbard with the sword and chuckled. Field is not surprised in his mind. It is even natural because his sword has been through so much. And battle wolves and a great battle wolf and even a whole dragon, but Field does not understand what of it. His Majesty ordered Field to stop. In front of Field and the Elven King stand huge carved doors, which are decorated with beautiful ligature and equipped with some kind of clockwork mechanism, probably responsible for their opening. His Majesty, standing in front of the huge doors, sharply extended his hand and made some passes, as if he had grabbed something invisible to the human eye. A crash and a grinding sound from the huge doors. Apparently, the hidden mechanism controlling the heavy doors had come into action. The Elven King is focused. He continues to control the door opening system from a distance. In response to the king's actions, the clock mechanism in the door began to move and loudly began to beat out a rhythm. All the gears and runners in the huge doors began to spin very quickly, and from all sides you could hear the clatter, grinding, and clanking of metal parts. Finally, the huge doors opened with a crash, revealing the blackness of the passage, and the amazed Field froze on the threshold, not daring to enter. Field and the Elven King are many times smaller than these huge doors. His Majesty, turning to Field, asked what he was looking at there, and then ordered him not to stand there like a pillar and to quickly go inside the room. Field is shocked by what he sees. He looks at what is happening with his eyes wide open. Obviously, he did not expect to see such an impressive action. Field followed the Elven King inside. His Majesty informed him that he and Field were in the Elven Treasury and that the items that had undergone a special enchantment procedure were kept there. Field was shocked. Inside, Field looks around with all his might, trying to see everything. And the king continues to say that naturally, he knows very well that there are almost no warriors left in his country who would be able to cope with these treasures. His Majesty turns to Field again. He really wants to ask Field something about the ability that he told him about earlier. If the ability really works as Field described, then His Majesty does not understand where Field will get so much experience. In order to get a solid amount of additional experience, there must be a decent amount of it to begin with. Field replies that Rusinus told him that there were large monsters in the plains north of the Elven country, and that he planned to use the experience gained from defeating them to distribute it among the elves. His Majesty understands what this is about. He assumes that Field will most likely be able to fight these monsters. But even if Rusinus goes with him, the experience that the two warriors will receive will still be insufficient to carry out their plan. In other words, His Majesty believes that the plan that Field had so emotionally come up with a little earlier lacks two important parts, namely teammates and suitable weapons. He drew Field's attention to the impressive sword that stood right in front of them. This sword was clearly not an ordinary one and was valuable. The Elven King shows Field a secret artifact that has been kept in the land of the elves for many generations. The Elven King raised the sword, whose name is Excalibur the Holy Sword. After making several swings of the beautiful sword, His Majesty announces that he wants Field to take this sword for himself and holds it out towards Field. His Majesty is ready to entrust Field with rare weapons and 100 of his best soldiers. He believes that this should be enough to carry out their plan. Field is shocked by such an offer and at first tries to refuse the king's gift. Field thinks that he cannot accept something as valuable as this sword. But His Majesty is adamant. He orders Field not to argue with him. His Majesty frowns. It is hard for him to talk about this. But he understands that in his weakened country there is currently no warrior strong enough to handle the sword Excalibur. His Majesty says that they have been trying for a very long time to find a warrior who would be worthy of this sword, but they have not found anyone. Or rather, that is how it was until today when Field appeared. Field listens intently to the king. His Majesty, holding the sword, knelt before Field. He says that he is sorry that he cannot help him anymore in carrying out the plan to save the country of the elves, and that he is very ashamed of this. Field looks in amazement at the kneeling king. For the sake of the future of the country of the elves, His Majesty asks Field to accept this sword from him and save the inhabitants of his country. His Majesty was very upset. He hesitated a little and then informed Field that he actually considered himself a helpless king. Field saw that the king's hands holding the sword were trembling slightly. Field understood everything. He resolutely took the sword from the hands of His Majesty and raised it in front of himself. Closing his eyes, Field tuned into the answer and said that he proudly accepts this gift from the King of the Elves. A little later, Field dresses in comfortable combat gear, throwing a hooded cloak over his shoulders. Field then deftly places all the necessary equipment on his body, snapping the buckles of the sling and scabbard. Field placed the holy sword Excalibur, entrusted to him by the Elven King, in the scabbard behind his back and placed it there comfortably. He is very focused and confident in himself and his actions. To complete the outfit, he put on gloves and clenched his fist. The door of the room where Field was putting on his combat suit, preparing for something important, swung open and Rusinas appeared on the threshold. Field thinks that he is now well prepared for the campaign. Rusinas calls his name from the door. It is time for him and the team of elves to set out on their journey. Field looks resolutely into the distance. As if mentally already halfway to the dangers awaiting them, he clearly intends to overcome everything. There is a squad of elven warriors on the street and Field introduces herself as the commander of the squad of elven soldiers. Her name is Agatha, and she is the captain of this squad. His Majesty has already told her everything. Field was about to answer something but hesitated, and then he began to say something incoherently about how he was just an outsider, a very ordinary person, and he was not asking them to trust him. His confused explanations were interrupted by Captain Agatha's loud laughter. Field was somewhat taken aback by such a violent reaction. Captain Agatha asks him to exhale and calm down because they will all follow Field. Firstly, such was the order of His Majesty, and secondly, they all have no choice in principle. Asks Captain Agatha if she is definitely not against following him since he is still very young. To this, Captain Agatha answers that for them, adult elves, all people are like children in age. Agatha wants to add something else. Captain Agatha, looking straight into Field's eyes, says that she believes that now races and years lived mean nothing, because now only the result is important for all of them. And then looking straight at Field, she asks him if he thinks the same as she does, and Field, looking into her eyes, silently agrees with her statement. Field and Agatha clearly understood each other. Rusinas, standing slightly behind Field, unusually calm, reminds him that on this mission, Mr. Field is the most important one. Field tensed up a little because it was a responsibility. That's why Rusinas thinks he should say something to his squad before the expedition. Field glanced thoughtfully to the side. It seems she's right. Field decided to be honest with the squad entrusted to him. Addressing the elves, he admits that for him, a stranger in the land of the elves, leading their battle is a very difficult matter. Field gathers strength to say the most important thing. He then boldly says that he saw various amazing things in this country, as well as the people who inhabit it. And although Field knows elves only a little, he likes it here. Field is very inspired, and therefore he asks the elves of the squad to believe him that he sincerely wants to protect the country of the elves. And for this, he needs their help. Continuing to speak with the elves, Field says that he is counting on every warrior in this detachment. The detachment of warriors listens to him attentively. After Field's fiery speech, Captain Agatha loudly gives the command to the detachment of warriors to move forward, because the future of their country depends on each of them. A foot detachment of elven warriors led by Captain Agatha and Field set out on a journey, heading for the northern plains where monsters live. The detachment, led alternately by Rusinas, Captain Agatha and Field, overcomes the difficult path to the goal through forests and mountains. steadfastly enduring all the hardships of the journey. Captain Agatha and Rusinas noticed that Field slept peacefully even in the difficult conditions of the difficult path in the forest. Captain Agatha and Field discussed the road, looking at the map and choosing the most convenient route suitable for a foot detachment. Finally, Captain Agatha decides to turn to Mr. Field with a request. She calls him by name. Field turned around at the sound of her voice. Captain Agatha informs him that they should make a halt because the soldiers from the detachment are completely exhausted. Field also paid attention to this. He understood everything. Captain Agatha sighs tiredly. Her appearance suggests that this path is difficult for her. She says that Mr. Field is an amazing person. Field just drinks water and does not understand what she is talking about. Captain Agatha explains to him that their detachment had been walking for several days in a row, and he was not even out of breath. It seems that Field really did not notice this and is now surprised by her remark. He silently looks at her. But the elves in the squad opposite are very tired. They have sat down in the clearing and are resting. Captain Agatha hopes that they will not become a hindrance to him when things take a serious turn. But Field does not think that the lights will be a hindrance. Captain Agatha asks Rusinas how far it is to the northern plains, since they have been walking for several days in a row. Rusinas replies that according to her calculations, they should have reached the place by now. Captain Agatha suggests that Field use his skills and analyze the area, because if the monsters are really big, he will be able to sense them without any difficulty. Field agrees with her and is ready to try. Captain Agatha and Rusinas watch Field as he uses his analysis skill to search for monsters, and ask each other in surprise what is going on. And Field at this time stands thoughtfully a little ahead. He thinks that this is strange. He found the monsters, but something is not right here. He reports that according to the analysis data he just received, the mark indicates that the monsters should be exactly in the place where their squad is now located. He asks Rusinas to break the ground a little. Field thinks they need to try something. Rusinas cries out in surprise at his request. Rusinas asks if Mr. Field can do it himself, but he counters that he has a very valuable sword in his hands. He cannot do it. After all, he was entrusted with the national treasure of the elves. He is not going to dig the earth for them. Then Rusinas asks Captain Agatha to pierce the ground instead of her, but she also refused to do it. Her ability greatly damages the sword, so she definitely won't do it. Field makes a pleading face and begs Rusinas to fulfill his request. Rusinas is not very keen on doing so and pretends to pout. In the end, she understood everything and agreed to do what he asked. Rusinas is focused. He confidently takes the weapon out of its sheath. Drawing her sword, Rusinas struck the ground beneath their feet. However, contrary to their expectations, nothing happened, and the ground cut by Rusinas's sword remained calm. Field is surprised and finds it strange. He hoped that the monsters would be hiding somewhere underground or something like that. He was about to say something else, but he was interrupted by a wild scream that burst out from the crevice. This cry is so strong and terrible that it plunges everyone present into horror. They scream that they do not understand what is happening. Captain Agatha gives the elves the command to immediately prepare for battle. And the excited Rusinas, trying to shout down the cry of the unknown monster, calls for Mr. Field. It seems she knows what it is. Captain Agatha immediately orders her warriors not to split up and try to reach the foot of the mountain. Field and Rusinas seem to be in a stupor, but then Field realized that the monster was not in the mountain. With a face distorted with surprise, Field stated out loud that the monsters he was looking for were not hiding in the mountain at all, but that the mountain itself was the monster. He clearly did not expect such a result. Right before the eyes of the amazed people and elves, what they thought was a mountain swelled, changed shape, and began to take on the outline of a huge monster, which continued to emit a terrifying cry. One day, a traveler found himself in a village that lay somewhere on the plains. The traveler, left without any money at all, asked one of the villagers to give him a place to stay for the night, and he, agreeing, took him to an empty house. The traveler, who had fallen into a peaceful sleep in an empty house on the plain, suddenly woke up in fright in the middle of the night, feeling how the place where he had spent the night began to shake. The unknown tremors of the earth continued until the morning. The traveler could not fall asleep again and waited for the shaking to stop so he could leave. When the tremors stopped, he left his shelter and, looking around, froze in place in surprise. The traveler saw an empty space before him. The village he had visited the day before had disappeared, leaving the traveler alone in the middle of a barren space, in which there remained only he and the small, unsightly house in which he had spent the night. A thunderous, wild roar resounded in the recently quiet forest space. A huge beast of gigantic size appeared before the heroes, opening its mighty mouth with a row of sharp, large teeth. Its enormous body moved, creating a terrible noise. Field stood frozen in shock, staring at the giant beast before him. The boy's body was overcome with tremors caused by the sudden appearance of the monster. Fear was written on his face and beads of sweat rolled down his body. Lunacies and Field stand nearby and watch the creature in amazement. The girl guesses who the creature is but does not voice her guesses. The guy begins to reason out loud, saying that the beast looks like a dragon without wings. Field suggests that the creature is a subspecies of dinosaur. At this time, the beast grows larger, its entire body growing in front of the group of warriors. It did not stop, its deafening roar continued to be heard throughout the area. The girl tells her comrades standing nearby that she has heard of monsters of large size, but never thought of a creature so huge. Field turns and loudly calls out to the warrior Agate, asking him about the whereabouts of the rest of the soldiers. Agate replies that the soldiers are in terror, but he managed to group them and restore the formation. But then he falls silent, hesitating to continue his thought. Field, having assessed the situation and listened to Agate, speaks loudly, worried that he himself understands the mood of the soldiers, frightened by such an enemy with whom they cannot cope with numbers alone. The young man was worried, sweat was pouring down his face. The young man adds to his words, confidently saying that attacking this monster openly, directly at it, is a real suicide for them. At this time, the monster opens its huge, homeless mouth and lets out a monstrous roar. As the beast slowly moves and maneuvers, one of the squad asks what they should do with this monster, saying that it has not noticed them yet. Another responds curtly that this is not at all like a normal monster hunt. Field turns to Agate and orders him that they should get the beast's attention before it gets away, so the boy asks the captain to try to get the soldiers to hold formation. He asks the girl to continue the attack. The girl briefly says that she understood the order. A gleam and anticipation appears in her eyes, and she takes her sword out of its sheath, making a sharp swing of her hand. With fire and determination in her eyes, Lunacies quickly and sharply brings down her sword, creating lines of immense force around herself, cutting through the air and space around her. The black lines from her sword, under the impact of the girl's blows, rush forward with all their strength and power, raising clouds of dust and cutting through the ground. With a loud noise, they crash into the monster's body, dealing him a significant blow. After this contact, there is silence. The beast does not move, frozen from the blow. He is in thought about the sensations he has just experienced. The monster froze, towering over the entire forest with its enormous body. The heroes do not know what to say for a few seconds, looking closely at the beast's reaction, and then someone asks for confirmation whether it has stopped. They answer in the affirmative. At that very moment, the monster dies, slowly starting to move again. It opens its huge mouth and lets out a thunderous roar with all its might, filled with malice, deafening all the surrounding area. The sound echoed throughout the space, causing the protagonist to cover their ears and cower from the force of the deafening roar. Lunacies squeezed her eyes shut, and Field's face twisted in discomfort, his teeth clenched tightly. Another loud roar was heard. Lunacies, crouching down, loudly asked why the monster had not reacted like that right away. Field, covering his ears with his hands more tightly, answered that the monster was very big, so the pain took a long time to reach the nervous system, and it took time. The monster suddenly turned away from them, as if deliberately ignoring the people in the forest thicket. Someone from the squad noted this in surprise, assuming that the creature simply had not noticed them yet. But Field did not agree with this assumption. He looked closely at the monster in front of him, analyzing its actions with his large, attentive eyes and trying to calculate them in advance, preventing its attack. The young man recalled his encounter with the dragon and his battle with it in the past, as if comparing these two creatures. He mentally noted to himself that the monster would not simply ignore them, letting them go. Suddenly, another sound was heard, which was getting closer and closer to the people and elves in the forest clearing. One of the elves heard it and asked excitedly what kind of sound was coming from near them. Field moved forward sharply, raising his hand and looking at Lunacies. He loudly gave the elf and Captain Agate the command to gather the troops and then stand behind him. The girl looked at his actions with surprise and confusion. The noise increased several times. The shock wave was already visible through the trees, approaching closer and closer to the army, sweeping away everything in its path with its power. Standing in front of the soldiers, Field turned to face them with a look of determination and concern. He shouted loudly, warning his squad that the monster would use its tail strike. The monster turned around and looked at the boy with its fierce eye. It swung its massive tail and powerfully slammed it into the ground, creating a powerful shockwave that rushed straight towards Field. The young man froze, not flinching, looking at the danger rushing towards him. Absorbing the monstrous shock wave with his eyes, Field mentally said only one thing, the name of the legendary sword in his hands, Excalibur. Of being handed this sword flashed through his mind, of the young man carefully holding it with both hands. listening to the information that it was a legendary treasure of the land of the elves, for good reason. Bringing the sword a little closer to himself, Field absorbed the words that the power of this sword did not depend on the physical strength of the owner, so the young man could best reveal its full potential. Field clearly remembered the way the Elven King had looked at someone when he had given him the precious blade. How he had insisted that the young man concentrate completely on the blade in order to awaken its full power. And in the youth's thoughts echoed the last words of the Elf Lord, who had said that the sword could do everything else for him. So Field raised Excalibur and concentrated, looking at the danger with a determined and warlike look. With a powerful blow, Field reflected the shock wave, causing a huge explosion. The monster, seeing this, opened its mouth in surprise, watching the unprecedented power. The blow was so powerful that it activated a strong wind wave that headed towards the elven squad. The soldiers tried their best to stay on their feet so as not to fall under the squall gusts of wind. Field stood there trying to recover, sighing and moaning heavily as blood began to pour down his face as his body was not prepared for the force and impact of his own blow. He stood wearily on his feet, leaning dangerously to the side, but for now he kept from falling, tightly gripping the legendary sword with his hands. In front of him gaped two halves of the monster's enormous tail, split in half by a powerful blow. The soldiers of the elven squad stood in amazement and watched as a large pool of blood flowed from the torn halves. Captain Agate couldn't believe his eyes and stood there, looking at the aftermath of the boy's blow in shock. There was a shocked expression on his face and his eyes were wide open, taking in what he saw. He repeated in disbelief, "How is this possible?" Feeling unbearable pain, the monster threw back its head and roared terribly. It raised its tail with the cut-off tip and let out an even louder roar than the previous one. Field insistently called Lunasis by name. The hero began to explain his plan to the elf in a hurry and quickly, which was that he would distract his attention, but the rest of the soldiers would be vulnerable at that moment if they gathered together. So he asked her to keep an eye on them. After giving the girl his instructions, Field tightened his grip on the sword and concentrated. He tensed his legs, strengthening them for a quick, high jump. Having completed the preparation of his body, the young man suddenly tore off from the spot, switching to a fast run. Behind him, a new shock wave roared which tried to overtake him, but Field, with a determined gleam in his eyes, rushed forward towards his goal. As he moved, thoughts swarmed through his head. Field analyzed the sword's abilities which were contained in the blade of light. He thought that if he miscalculated the strength of his attack, it would affect his soldiers as well, but he decided to think about it later. Field raised the legendary blade and thrust it forward, activating its ability. The sword glowed with a bright light. The young man swung his blade sharply, crushing the trees in front of him with its force and cutting them into pieces. Mentally, he told himself that he had to keep attacking. Having determined himself, Field made another cut of great power. Excalibur's blow was so powerful that it reached the monster's face in a matter of seconds. Not expecting this, the monster was unable to dodge or defend itself from it, so it could only watch intently as the cut reached its wide-open eyes. The cut hits the monster's eye exactly. Feeling the terrible pain from the blow, the monster opened its sharp mouth wide, and a heartrending cry of pain came from it. The beast fell to the ground under the weight of the blow. Seeing how the blow affected the monster, the soldiers of the elven army perked up and began to rejoice. They enthusiastically said that despite the fact that the beast was so huge, they would be able to wound it and they would cope with it. Captain Agate did not share the general delight, looking warily at the wounded monster. In his thoughts, he could not agree with the words of the other elves. Although the monster had fallen, it was not defeated. It changed its position and stretched its mouth forward, looking at the warrior and soldiers with evil dark eyes, thirsting for revenge. Agate noted to himself that it was too early to talk about defeating it. Field ran quickly through the forest thicket, thinking and analyzing the current situation. He noted to himself that the blade of light in his hands only pierced the outer layer of the monster's skin. The young man began to consider his next steps. Looking around, Field thought that he needed to come up with something else to defeat the monster. Accelerating at full speed, the fearless youth jumped towards the monster, holding the legendary sword tightly in his palm. With deafening force, he directed a powerful blow at the monster's body, creating several explosions on its inner shell and destroying its structure. This did not go without consequences for Field himself, because the rough rock cracked in some places under him, crumbling. At the last moment, the young man was able to grab hold of some stone with his fingers, saving himself from falling. With a loud cry, Field pulled himself up and climbed to the surface, holding tightly to the rock shell. He shouted that it was a losing tactic to compete with the monster in endurance, and said to attack its most vulnerable places. With all his might, the young man struck the monster again with the legendary elven sword, gathering all its power. Field really did destroy the monster's stone shell. But because of this, he himself became vulnerable, losing support under his feet and starting to fall. Having made things worse for himself, the young man began to fall into the unknown. Suddenly, the huge mouth of a monster opened beneath him, trying to swallow him and save itself from danger. With a loud sound and a satisfied expression on its face, the monster swallowed the young man, stretching out its entire body. The elven army watched everything that happened. Lunasis cried out in alarm, not wanting to believe her eyes. Her face was frightened. She shouted Field's name loudly. Suddenly, the monster's closed mouth began to glow. A loud and insistent voice from it resolutely convinced itself to concentrate on the legendary blade. With a spark of determination in his eyes and a determination that was evident in every line of his face, Field shouted to himself that the monster inside was not as hard and strong as the outside with its tough outer shell. Summoning all his strength into his legendary elven blade, the young man created a huge beam of light that traveled across the entire width of the monster's internal organs, sweeping away the monster's huge snow-white teeth in its path. Field used his ultimate ability. Its name was Holy Destroyer. Under the influence of this enormous power, the monster's mouth opened wide and a blinding beam of light began to shoot out from inside it in all directions. The beam from the legendary elven sword was so powerful that the monster could not withstand its onslaught. The monster's enormous body was cut into two even halves that glowed brightly with a snow-white light. The elves looked at the battle before them in amazement. Their faces showed surprise and delight, and the crowd could hear exclamations of delight and words about how Field had managed to defeat the monster. The monster's body fell to the ground with a crash. The elven soldiers, seeing this, talked among themselves, saying that Field had managed to defeat the monster and kill it. Someone joyfully shouted that the young man had managed to slay the creature. Only Lunasis did not share the general delight. She looked up with wide, amazed eyes peering into the heights of the sky. The elf's face showed fear and concern for the young man. The girl asked worriedly where Field was. At that moment, something was rapidly falling from the sky, approaching the ground and the forest clearing faster and faster. The unidentified object turned out to be Field, who was rapidly falling towards the ground. His body is in poor condition after using his maximum powers. It is riddled with fatigue and exhaustion. The young man falls quickly, his sword flying next to him, released from his hands. His thoughts rush around in Field's head. He realizes with panic that neither his body nor a single muscle in it obeys him. He tries to move his fingers, but they do not move either. His tired eyes look at the sky, they fill with tears. He understands that his body has no strength, no mana, no motor abilities. The young man thinks with concern that he cannot so stupidly go into oblivion, wasting his life in vain. Field continues to fall rapidly, tears streaming from his eyes which the wind carries into the air. With his last strength, he stretches out his hand forward, hoping that he can change something. The young man regrets his ability. Lunasis saw from the ground how the boy's body was rapidly falling down. Not wanting to accept the tragic outcome, she called upon her magic and directed it to her legs, preparing to catch the boy during his landing. Crouching down, she braced her legs to be ready to cushion Field's landing. She opened her arms, watching the boy fly closer and closer to her, calculating the place where he should fall. As the boy got closer and closer to the ground, Lunasis screamed his name loudly, looking at him with frightened eyes. Just as Field was very close to falling, the elf extended her arms and leaned her body back a little, trying to soften his landing. Their two bodies connected, and they both fell to the ground with a loud thud. But the girl softened the boy's fall, minimizing the consequences. A few meters away from them, the legendary elven sword fell and clanged against the surface. Lunasis, holding the young man in her arms, called him by name and imploringly asked him not to leave her. Field slowly opened his tired eyes and, looking at the elf, hesitantly asked her if he had really completed his task. The girl held the young man in her arms carefully and gently. Hearing his question, she looked at him with disbelief, looking at him in surprise and trying to comprehend that he remained alive and unharmed. Her mouth dropped open in surprise. She remained silent, looking with her eyes at the living young man in her arms. Field continued to ask timidly, asking her if he was dreaming all of this. Coming to her senses, Lunasis smiled widely with relief, unshed tears frozen in her eyes, which looked at the young man with tenderness. She carefully told him that she could give him the potion mouth to mouth, and then he would get up and see everything for himself. Field smiled happily, looking at the girl with one eye. He grinned at her words, and while the elf gently stroked his dirty cheek with her fingers, the young man told her that he was fine and that he could cope on his own without a magic potion. They were lying in the middle of an empty space, far away from everyone. Seeing them, worried Captain Agate and other elves quickly started running to them to help the commander and express their gratitude. It was time to return to the elven residence. The Elven King and his assistant turned around in surprise at the returning detachment, not reliving their quick return. Before them appeared joyful and contented warriors, who with pride and a sense of accomplishment returned to the king. The faces of Lunasis, Field, and Agate were lit up with happy smiles. She supported him so that he did not fall. The Elven King just watched as the soldiers entered the palace, returning home. As they crossed the threshold, Lunasis released Field and opened her arms to embrace her father. The ceremony began in front of the palace gates. All the inhabitants of the elven country gathered in the square, anxiously awaiting the beginning. In front of them, Field, Lunasis, and her father towered above. Field closed his eyes and concentrated, calling upon his ability. He extended his hands forward and began to fill them with his magic, causing the light to come from within. The elves in the square watched in amazement as everything happened. They began to glow, feeling how the young man's ability filled them with power and increased their magic. The elves smiled and joyfully celebrated such an event. Many in the square hugged their relatives, trying to share their common happiness. Someone was already starting to boast about their newfound strength. Field and Lunasis watched all this proudly and contentedly. They stood with joyful smiles. Feeling something, Lunasis turned away from watching the square and turned back, peering at the approaching figure. Right in front of her stood Illumina, who had managed to get out of bed and come to this event. She looked at Lunasis with confusion, her small hands clutching the cape thrown over her shoulders. Lunasis froze in shock, looking at the little elf in front of her. She looked at her carefully, trying to comprehend everything. Then, without further hesitation, the elf rushed to Illumina and hugged her tightly, pressing the confused girl to herself. Field turned around in surprise, watching all this. The young man watched the girl's embrace. Suddenly there was movement next to him, and only a slight breeze reminded him of how quickly the king had moved. The Elven King quickly jumped up from his seat and, not caring about the little things, fell to his knees in front of his daughters. He hugged them tightly, squeezing them in his arms. The girls just froze in confusion, not expecting this from their father. The man began to sob, choking on tears and not hiding his emotions. Lunasis watched in shock as her father's body shook as he gave in to his emotions. Tears appeared in her eyes. Field stood to the side and watched as the family of elves rejoiced and comforted each other in their arms, mourning all the trials they had gone through. His lips curled, but he said nothing. Field only smiled softly, watching how life in the land of the elves gradually began to change for the better. As the elves rejoiced in the square and danced in celebration, the queen noted out loud that she could not remember the last time their country had shone so brightly. The elven king and queen stood at the balcony railing and watched their subjects rejoice. The man turned to face her and softly called her name. Looking down, he admitted to his wife that she was right. The king noted that even if he spent his whole life trying to repay Field for what he had done, it would not be enough, and noted that over the years he had become coarse and his feelings dulled. They saw the joy on the faces of their subjects who were carefully enjoying their happiness. Gaius said that he had been wrong all along and his daughter was right, but Lunalia gently disagreed with him. She noted that the path to a better life for the elves was paved by an artifact created by their ancestors, and the elves of their kingdom and Illuminal will be able to continue their lives only thanks to him and Lunasis, who fought to the end. Gaius then looked away and asked in confusion where Field had gone. He explained that he wanted to talk to him because the king wanted to get to know his future son-in-law better. Lunalia just looked at her husband and expressed her surprise. At this time, Field was rummaging around in the bushes trying to find a way out. He quietly whispered out loud, looking for it, that it should have been somewhere below. The young man shuddered sharply when his name was called from behind him. Lunasis stood behind him, holding his robe in her hands and handing it to the boy, saying that he had forgotten it. Field turned his eyes to her and looked at the girl with a displeased expression on his face. The young man reached out and took the robe, thanking the elf. He then asked her why she was dressed as if she were going on a long hike. She replied that she had decided to go with him, and then asked how he was going to get through the maze of fog on his own. Lunasis looked down and began to fidget awkwardly with her braid. She noted that the country was not yet saved, and that this time they had managed to avoid disaster thanks to a miracle. The elf summed up that they still had a long way to go. The girl also noticed that although Mr. Field was strong, he was very quick with his hands because he decided to use such a powerful ability without thinking ahead, and if he had fallen less successfully, he would have definitely died. The young man just stood there, amazed by her words. Then Lunasis quickly and passionately added that she wanted Field to live a long and happy life. The young man casually asked why she was so worried about him, only because the country of the elves badly needed his strength. Field clasped his hands behind his head and stood relaxed, waiting for the girl's answer. Lunasis said briefly and firmly that he was wrong. The young man turned to her. The elf standing before him said decisively that the reason for her concern was that she wanted to be with him, even if their time together was short. Lunasis fell silent after her words. She looked straight at Field. Her lips stretched into a gentle smile and her eyes sparkled with warmth and softness towards the young man. The precious earrings in the girl's ears swayed in the wind, sparkling. Field threw his robe over himself and wrapped himself in it. He awkwardly tugged at his collar, not knowing how to react to the elf's words. His cheeks flushed, betraying his embarrassment. He quickly turned away from Lunasis, not wanting to show her his embarrassment. He pretended not to care, so he casually blurted out that her actions were none of his business and that she should do whatever she wanted. The elf only smiled contentedly. Suddenly they both froze, feeling that there was a third person among them. Lunasis turned her gaze to the girl in the hat with rabbit ears. The boy and girl cried out in surprise when they saw Illumina joining them. The girl stood with a wide and proud smile, holding what looked like a broom tied with a bow, and was ready to go with them on their journey. At this time, chaos was taking place in the dirty sewer pipe. The entire cramped space was stained with an unpleasant liquid, and unpleasant sighs and curses were heard from afar. Loud squeaks of rat-like creatures were heard. They looked dissatisfied and angry. Next to them, bitter words were heard from a man who claimed that he and his comrades used to be the strongest guild. In front of the horde of large rats were Field's former guild mates. They looked scared and depressed, with large tears rolling down from the eyes of the warrior Bonsa. The leader, Claude, wondered at their situation in confusion. They grouped together in a narrow sewer tunnel and were ready to defend themselves. From the other side of the tunnel, moles were rapidly approaching them, squeaking aggressively and angrily. Claude wondered in bewilderment why all this was happening to them. Claude recalls the past, namely his first meeting with Field. In his memory, he sees the face of a heavy-set soldier who calls him loudly and insistently and asks him to come to him for a second. At this time, Claude is playing cards with a fair-haired young man. His usually long hair is pulled back to keep it out of his way. He looks around with displeasure, looking coldly at the soldier. His opponent throws away his cards with a sad expression, thinking about the lost money. Claude gets up from his seat and approaches the soldier, who turns out to be the head of the guild. He asks him what happened and questions who the boy is, whom he persistently brings to him. The boy clutches a strange book to himself. The guild leader says that he took him from the shelter where they stayed a few days ago. The soldier continues his speech, calling the boy fresh blood of their guild. He asks Claude to make sure the child is ready to carry out his tasks and does not die in the process. The man asks why this task was entrusted to him. The other guild members immediately start laughing at Claude, shouting that they brought him some boy and now he has become his nanny. The man only turns to them, angry at their words. He turns back and raises his hand, scratching the back of his head in irritation. Claude asks himself with displeasure why this is happening to him, and then turns his attention to the boy and asks his name. The boy continues to clutch the book he brought with him. He looks at the man in front of him with big eyes and says that his name is Field. Claude returns to the merciless reality of his memories. His entire body is covered in bruises and contusions. A large lump has swollen on his cheek. He is being carried down the street upside down, hanging almost unconscious. All the members of the guild walk along the deserted city street, dirtying the tiles with their dirty footprints. They are all covered in dirt and dust, and are walking defeatedly in search of a place to spend the night. A heavy soldier carries Claude on his shoulder. Claude gradually came to his senses. Someone noted this by screaming, to which he immediately received a shout from another member of the guild, who advised him to move faster, so as not to be caught on the street, which would lead to trouble. The guild leader complained of pain in his arm and discomfort on his face. His arm was indeed in bad condition, with blood flowing from a wound on it. Dorothy asked the man worriedly if he had already forgotten what had happened to him. She told him about how a giant rat attacked him in the sewers and bit him. Claude only indifferently repeated the words about the giant rat. Dorothy could not restrain herself and pounced on him with accusations, saying that they took on this case because he told them that it was an easy matter, and in the end he was almost eaten by rats and they had to retreat. The witch continued to scold the man, saying that he was the only one to blame for what happened to his face, because it was Claude who decided to swing his fists at the client, and he decided to fight him off, and if it weren't for the military police, the man wouldn't have survived there. Dorothy summed up that she had told them not to take on tasks from other adventurers. Someone reproached her for her own agreement, and another asked them not to argue, for which he also received a rebuke from the witch. Claude looked at the ground, defeated. The guild leader gave a bitter verdict that they had failed to complete the task. All four of them approached the door of the house. The door opened, and Bonsa, with Claude on his shoulder, began to walk in. They were met with mocking words from the people sitting in the room, who greeted the guild master with mockery. In front of them sat several thugs, drinking alcohol and doing nothing. One of them mockingly addressed those who had returned, asking where they had found an employer but then brushed it off, saying that he was only interested in money. The 4 members began to climb the stairs. The men mockingly raised their glasses and shouted a toast to their guild. Dorothy cast a hostile and contemptuous glance at these drunkards and called them freeloaders out loud. She continued her thought, saying that they would continue to sit in this house until the money ran out. Carl noted that everyone who decided to stay in the guild was like that. He asked Claude to sit down and said that he would take care of his treatment. The monk took the man's wounded hand and began to work healing magic on his wound. His palms glowed with magic as he carefully held the man's hand in his palms and gently tried to heal his wound. Carl quickly pointed out that he was not succeeding, but then said that they had tried very hard anyway. Dorothy looked at her palms and noted bitterly that, as she had thought, they had lost all their strength. She then clarified that rather they had returned to their original level. Claude extended his hand and looked at it. The bloody bandage had slipped off, revealing a large wound mark. Carl removed his hands and hastily said that he somehow managed to stop the bleeding, but he kindly advised the man to contact a normal healer at the clinic. Seeing how Carl was fussing and how Claude sat with such defeated fatigue, Dorothy flared up and shouted loudly that this whole thing was complete nonsense. She screamed even louder, waving her arms. The witch asked who came up with the principle that if they returned to their initial level, then they had room to grow because they simply completed tasks using force, so they had already forgotten how to fight. Dorothy continued loudly that killing rats was a beginner's task and was the easiest job. She then blamed Bonsu for getting scared and screaming, which led to the rats attacking. He just looked at her sadly. Bonsa began to justify himself, saying that he could not help himself. He noted that they were all strong before, so such problems did not arise, and they also had strong magical support and a large supply of healing magic. He then pulled out a simple wooden bat and insistently asked Dorothy to look at it, since it was now the only piece of equipment he could use. Bonsa sadly noted that now he could not relax at all. Carl listened to his comrades' complaints and agreed with them. He added that Mr. Bonsa was not a strong man to begin with, and this information had completely slipped his mind. The man listened to the monk and wiped tears from his eyes. Dorothy thoughtfully listed the problems with the guild's arrears and paying its members. She noted that the longer they put it off, the more their debt would accumulate, and then after a while the country might disband their guild altogether. Carl looked at Dorothy, listening to her words with a disappointed look. The witch added a little more about the dissolution of the guild. She said that if they announced the dissolution of their guild, the country would be able to minimize the unpaid debts. Bonsa listened to her words with tears rolling down his cheeks. Dorothy announced the bitter outcome that would befall their guild if events were to proceed as they had. If that happened, the dawn of glory would be over. Carl looked away and said that when everything was going well for them, he thought about the guild's eternal existence. He added that he could never have imagined such a shameful end for them. The monk continued, turning to Dorothy, that if she had said such a thing in their better days, they would all have laughed at her. Bonsa agreed with him, but suddenly Claude spoke up, declaring that it was not over for them yet. He confidently shouted that the dawn of glory would begin again, and one mistake could not mean anything to them, because they just needed one more task, in which they would not prove themselves. Bonsa and Carl looked at his outburst in bewilderment, the monk even called him. Claude continued fanatically, ignoring the other members' hesitation, saying that they simply had to try harder and their dreams would come true. But then Dorothy cut him off abruptly, calling him by name slowly. She insistently asked him to come down to earth. Claude froze in amazement, squeezing the wrist of his injured hand with his fingers. Claude began to shake in excitement. He asked abruptly whether this was not their desired dream, and pointed out that the dawn of glory would not be wasted just like that, and they would be able to make it the best guild that would be known throughout the world. Dorothy ran her hand through her hair, tugging at a long strand, and calmly noted that this was his dream, not theirs. Carl followed up by saying that this was no longer possible. Bonsa said, covering his face with his hand, that everything looked so good because of their constant luck, and the fact that they had achieved everything not through their own efforts, but were self-confidently unaware of it. Carl briefly agreed with Bones' words. Claude's eyes widened in amazement. He refused to believe what he heard. Dorothy began listing indifferently that they had high expenses for running the guild, which they could not afford at the moment. She noted that they did not fit the description of the best guild at all. The witch folded her arms across her chest and sighed heavily, saying that they should at least be glad that they had been able to come so far in just 3 years. Claude cried out in confusion, asking them what they would do if the Dawn of Glory Guild disappeared, since they couldn't do anything without it. Carl looked away and sheepishly shared that he had long been thinking about opening a massage therapy office. Although he couldn't handle wounds, he could certainly treat pain in the hip or back. Bonsa said with a smile that he was thinking about returning to his hometown because he was worried about his mother, who was having a hard time being all alone. Someone asked about Dorothy's plans. The witch smeared her palms and shared that she was tired of being a magician because those ineffective spells were of no use to anyone. She stood in a chic pose and noted with a smile that they had nothing but a charming face, so Dorothy decided to find herself some rich old man. Carl looked at her in surprise, and Claude insistently asked her to wait. The man cried out loudly and discontentedly, asking if the girl was really going to leave him just like that. Hearing these words, Carl and Bonsa froze in amazement, and Dorothy only waved her hand indifferently, noting that nothing could be done. Bonsa leaned over and, covering his mouth with his hand, asked Carl in surprise if the two were really in a relationship. The monk also covered his mouth and asked in response how he could not know this. Dorothy continued to surprise Claude with her words, saying that two unemployed people had no reason to see each other. She noted that the man used to have money and status, and also said that they had peculiar characters and the relationship between them was not very good. Claude stood there, stunned by the onslaught of harsh words. Sweat was pouring down his face. Dorothy continued, saying that everything was in the past between them because they had lost everything and he even more, so now there was nothing that attracted her to him. The man could only repeat some of her words in confusion, as if realizing that she was right. The witch noted that he himself should understand perfectly well how sad things were. She remembered how they had attacked a man and taken him hostage, and persistently asked him questions about whether he knew why the king had spared them and they had not lost their heads. Dorothy herself answered all these questions, saying that all this was due to the fact that Field did not testify against them. Claude stood frozen in amazement with his eyes open, listening to the witch say that perhaps Field was too naive, but it was his naivety that allowed them to live, so they should take advantage of it. She noted that one can live without dreaming of anything. Dorothy turned and walked towards the exit, telling Claude that she was now saying goodbye to him, and although it had been fun, it was all over. Bonsa and Carl followed her. The monk thanked him, said goodbye to him, and said that he would go too. Claude clutched the armrests of his chair, sitting gloomily with his head down. Carl called Bones to go to the exit, and he, after a short hesitation, agreed and went with them. The warrior shared that he had been saving money since the time when they were a successful guild, so for some time he could not work, but just spend all his time with his mother. Bonsa noted that he had sent her letters, but his heart was still heavy. Carl remembered the man talking about her poor health, and the warrior agreed, saying that she had problems with her hips. Claude grabbed his head, bending it low to his body. They had almost reached the door. Carl said that if he and his mother were in town, they should stop by and he would give them a massage. Bonsa thanked him heartily. They had almost left Claude when he suddenly jumped up from his chair and ran after them. Bonsa smiled broadly, thinking about the future that was opening up before him. He noted that when the money ran out, he would get a job as a farmer for a neighbor, because in his second life he wanted to wield a shovel, not a gun. His smile was wide and happy as he concluded that such a life would not be so bad for him. Claude stood behind him holding a sharp knife in both hands. With a grim and determined look, he swung it, and a loud thud was heard. Below, the drunken guild members were drinking merrily and raising their glasses high. One of the men called loudly to the guild leader, seeing him coming down, and asked him if they had really been dividing up the money the old way up there. He raised his glass and thanked him with a smile for the guild trying so hard for them, its members. Claude calmly walked past him. The man froze and stopped smiling, looking attentively at the departing head of the guild. Claude headed for the door, clutching a bloody knife in his hand under the fabric of his cloak. The man looked at him with displeasure and took a sip from his mug, wondering why the chief was so silent today. A loud cry came from above. The man choked on his drink in shock as a shrill scream came from above, calling for someone to come over. One of the drunks ran up to the stairs and asked what had happened. At the top, a man with tears in his eyes was babbling incoherently that he had only wanted to ask the guild management to pay for the drinks. Then he insistently asked for the military police to be called. The guild members quickly went upstairs. They saw a hand with manicured fingers lying on the floor in a pool of blood. A terrible sight opened up before those who arrived. 3 lifeless bodies lay in pools of blood in the room. Apart from them, there was no one else in the room. The men at the entrance froze in amazement, looking at the picture that opened up before them. Bonsa, Carl, and Dorothy were dead. One of the men shouted loudly that all the guild officers had been killed. The guild members looked at this terrible sight in horror. Fear and disgust were written on their faces. One asked in amazement what could have happened to them. The focus shifted from the scary events to the main characters who were training. Lunasis held the sword in the river and tried to concentrate, but she couldn't do anything, and the elf closed her eyes in helplessness, trying to calm down and suppress her irritation. She turned around with an embarrassed expression and asked Field that if he continued to stare at her like that, he would burn a hole in her. Lunasi said there was still plenty of time before the changing of the guard. Field smiled sheepishly and scratched his face with his finger, making a noise of agreement. During their conversation, Illumina was sleeping peacefully in the tent under a warm blanket. Field asked if Lunasi's was practicing her swings, to which she replied in the affirmative. The girl placed her hand more firmly on her sword and added that it was important to hone the basics, and then asked the young man if there was anything wrong with that. After hesitating for a few seconds, Field carefully asked Lunasi's what she thought of his sword. The elf looked at him in surprise at this question, asking again about the sword. The girl thought about the guy's question, supporting her cheek with her finger and looking away, thinking. She then added happily that his sword was a national treasure of the elves, the magical properties of which were extremely strong, and the sharpness of its blade and elegant design were also perfect. Field indignantly blurted out that he had not meant that. He added that he wanted to know the opinion of the one called the Saint of the Sword about his swordsmanship. Lunasi's tilted her head to the side in surprise, not expecting such a request from the young man. The elf raised her hand to her chin and thoughtfully asked if Field expected an honest answer from her. The young man, standing opposite her, nodded seriously and gave a short affirmative answer. Field tensed as the girl began to speak and prepared to listen to her attentively. Lunasi's began to share her opinion with him. She waved her finger and noted that Field was indeed very strong, but in terms of swordsmanship, he still had a lot of growing to do. Lunasi's remarked that if he had wielded a sword at the proper level, his old sword would not have been so worn out. Field listened to her words with his mouth open, amazed. Continuing to express her thoughts about the young man's abilities, the elf bent down and picked up a long branch from the ground, deciding to use it as a kind of pointer. Raising the twig into the air, she began to analyze his swordsmanship with a smart look. Lunasi's noted that the Gigarex that Field had defeated back then could not have been defeated by anyone other than him. She then continued by saying that there were more suitable places to attack with the Blade of Light than the forest thicket and a large monster. Using a twig, the elf drew an image of a Gigarex on the ground and showed that if Field wanted to deprive it of mobility, then it was necessary to aim at the base of the fin. The young man asked about attacking the eyes, but she noted the loss of the beast's attention. Lunasi's continued her explanation, explaining that if the monster was also huge in size, then when attacking the eyes, it could go berserk and cause damage in all directions. Field thought about it and agreed with the elf's arguments. The young man looked at the girl and clenched his fist tightly. He told her that he wanted to ask her for a favor. Looking straight at Lunasi's, Field asked her to teach him how to fight with a sword. The girl looked at him in surprise, not expecting such a request. The girl was silent for a few seconds, and then carefully asked what the point of this was for the young man, who was already stronger than her. Field thought about it for a bit and said that such a request was related to his ability, because no matter what his status was, he still had too little battle experience that he wanted to make up for. Behind Lunasi's, the beautiful stars sparkled in the night sky. The girl stood silently and patiently listened to the young man's reasoning about his abilities. Field noted that now he is basically no different from himself in his younger years, who managed to survive only thanks to his ability. With a determined gleam in his eyes, Field firmly said that he wanted to become stronger as an adventurer, and strive to ensure that his strength did not come from his ability. Again Claude's memories, only this time about the terrible crime he committed against his comrades. He plunged his hand into Bones' side. The tall man froze in surprise as he watched Claude twist the knife in his body. He made a questioning sound, not understanding what was happening. The guild leader pulled out a knife and blood started to flow. Bonsa fell to his knees, not believing the red liquid flowing out of his body. He asked why this happened. Tears began to flow from his eyes, and he said in monosyllables that his body was in pain. And then Bonsa remembered his mother and began to sob even harder. Carl and Dorothy stood in the doorway, amazed, watching their comrades suffer on the floor. The monk's mouth opened wide in surprise. Suddenly Claude made a swift dash and approached Carl, firmly grabbing him by the neck with his palm. The monk only had time to ask who did all this. Claude lifted his smaller body into the air and squeezed his hand tighter. A disgusting sound of bones crunching echoed through the room. The man himself stood with disheveled hair and a terrible face, on which one could already see madness. Claude threw the limp body aside and began to advance on the frightened Dorothy, who was pressed against the wall. On his way he stepped into a pool of blood, and now his shoes were dirty with it. The witch looked at the approaching man with fear. Large tears rolled from her eyes, and she bitterly turned to Claude, saying that he would have no way back. Claude ordered her to be silent in a commanding voice and raised his sword, swinging it for a better blow. His eyes were burning with the possessed gleam of madness. Claude burst into mad laughter. He clutched the bloody blade and cried with a smile on his lips. Continuing to behave like the last madman, Claude opened his eyes and confidently declared that he knew who was to blame for everything. Leaving the tavern, he jumped on his horse and began to walk away from the scene of his terrible crime, continuing to laugh madly and moving away into the night. The events that will now be described took place after Field and the Elven detachment returned to the capital. The Elven King stood majestically and addressed the warriors, noting that they had to endure a lot, but they coped with everything. He continued by saying that later a full celebration would be held, and from now on this day would be considered their national holiday, which they would celebrate from generation to generation. The elves happily supported his words. Gaius turned to Mr. Field and remarked that he must be tired after such a long hike, so he suggested that he visit the hot springs that were in the royal palace. The Elven King strongly recommended that the young man visit these springs and then get a good night's sleep without worrying about his clothes, which the servants would take care of. Field stood wearily before the man, finding the last of his strength to thank him. Heavy hot steam spread through the luxurious interior of the hot springs, which were located inside the royal palace. Field lay in a wide spring, enveloped in steam, and enjoyed the hot water, stretching his arms out in front of him. It spread throughout the entire source, quite telling what bliss it is to be in a luxurious place where you can relax, catch your breath, and just pleasantly warm up. Field noted that it was so humid in this place, and that his clothes would probably take a long time to dry. A voice next to him replied that the elves dried their clothes on the rock, which was heated by geothermal heat, making their clothes thin. The young man raised his wet hand and said that when he looked at the city from afar, it seemed to him that these were splashes of water. But most likely, now he thought that it was steam. Illumina handed Field a cup and poured water from a jug into it. She said that it was water collected from forest trees, so it was cold and a little sweet. Field happily accepted it, sharing that he had just wanted to wet his throat. The elf and the young man sat peacefully in the hot water. Field noted that it was a very pleasant sensation as the water spread over his exhausted body. Illumina held the jug in her hands with a smile. Suddenly Field realized that he was not alone in the hot spring. He screamed loudly and shrilly, so loudly that it could be heard well beyond the baths. The elves passing by only looked around in surprise at this noise. The young man jumped back from the elf several meters, blushing deeply and covering his naked body with his hands. He loudly called her by name, persistently asking what she was doing here. Illumina also covered herself and her cheeks turned red. She said with a sweet smile that she just wanted to rub his back, and then asked with concern if she was bothering him here. Field told her that the elf was not exactly bothering him, but he still did not understand why she was there. Illumina replied that he had saved the elves and her as well, so she wanted to somehow thank her savior. The young man asked about her nakedness. The elf tilted her head in surprise, answering that they were in hot springs, and asked if they should go in there with their clothes on. Field turned his head away from her in embarrassment and agreed with her in some ways, still embarrassed by her nakedness. Illumina put her hand on her thin collarbones and sadly asked if the young man didn't like her body. She noted that she was sick a lot, so her body didn't look as beautiful as her sister's. He said that he didn't think her body was ugly. Suddenly, hurried footsteps were heard on the wet wooden floor of the royal hot springs. Lunasis ran into the room, covering herself with only a towel. Illumina, who was saying Mr. Field's name at that moment, looked at her sister in surprise, and she loudly shouted her name. Flustered and blushing from embarrassment and the heat of the baths, Lunasis hurriedly asked her sister why she was here alone with Mr. Field. The younger elf replied that she only wanted to wash the boys back in the hot springs, to which the older elf sternly stated that she was not allowed to do such a thing. At this time, Field almost completely hid under the water, embarrassed. He lifted his head sharply from the water and choked when suddenly Lunasis appeared naked next to him, her towel falling off. She screamed loudly, burning with embarrassment that instead of her sister she would do this and rub his back. Illumina complained that her sister had arrived later than her, so it was unfair, and Lunasis retorted that it was because she had run away from her. Field covered his face with his hands and said that he was ready to agree to anything if only the sisters would not quarrel over him. In the end they came to an agreement. Field sat burning with embarrassment. Behind him was Lunasis, rubbing his back with a towel, and behind her sat Illumina with a bucket of water on her lap, smiling at her sister. With a joyful, wide smile on her lips, her happy face shining, Lunasis asked the young man if he was pleased with her actions. He again covered his red face and answered affirmatively, thanking the girl. The elf poured water on his back, washing away the foam. Field noted that it was very unusual for him to feel someone washing his back. Lunasis asked if he had ever experienced anything like this in his life. Field smiled, remembering life in the orphanage. He replied that he grew up surrounded by many small children who washed his back, trying to imitate him. He sighed with nostalgia, feeling how girl's fingers gently washed his hair. Gently running her fingers through the boy's hair, Lunasis noted that she had once done the same, remembering how she had often rubbed her father's back before. She continued her actions with a smile and noticed that it was a very interesting feeling inside her, as if they were a real family. Realizing what she had said, the girl suddenly pulled away from Field and blushed, starting to babble about how she didn't mean that they should become a family right now. But on the other hand, if the young man wanted it right now, then she wouldn't refuse. But her worries were in vain. Field, lulled by the peaceful atmosphere and fatigue, fell fast asleep. Lunasis and Illumina looked in surprise at the sleeping youth, who was sleeping peacefully and shaking his head slightly. They looked at each other. Then both elves laughed happily, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere in the royal hot springs. When Field woke up some time later, all three threw their capes over themselves and sat down on a bench, enjoying the warmth and drinking water from a jug. Several smiling elves appeared before Field, holding formal dresses in their hands. One of them addressed him respectfully and asked him to put on the clothes she was handing him. The young man sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the unexpected guests with a disheveled and sleepy look. He wondered if he really needed to dress up like that. He grumbled discontentedly that he could just go in his usual outfit. The main girl ignored all his words and shouted at the other girls to get ready. She noted that it was necessary to help Mr. Field to get ready as quickly as possible. They all crowded around the young man and began to dress him up, and all he could do was give in to their persistent pressure. Dressed in a formal suit made from luxurious fabrics, Field fidgeted, tugging at the sleeves of his shirt. He felt his hands in the expensive fabric and couldn't help but ask why such a hassle with this suit was necessary. The royal ball was in full swing. There were many elven couples dancing on the dance floor, enjoying this celebration. Field stood to the side and chewed a donut, thinking about how he did not like to wear unfamiliar clothes. He also noted that he constantly caught curious glances from elves. Suddenly someone called out to him, and a girl ran up to him. The beautiful Illumina appeared before him in a beautiful dress. She noted that this outfit suited Field very well, and the young man himself, trying to wipe the donut crumbs from his mouth, greeted her. He covered his face with his hands, embarrassed by the girl's compliment, and thanked her, noting that he was very embarrassed by her words. The elf waved her hands in displeasure and asked him again, answering that she had said this absolutely seriously. Field noted that Illumina seemed to be getting better. She confirmed this with a proud smile, straining her arms and saying that her body was filled with magic, so she was full of energy again. She remembered the moment when her mana reserves ran out, and the elf thought then that she would never be able to move again. But then Illumina added that it was at that very moment that Mr. Field and her sister had saved her. The young man stood and listened to her, embarrassed, rubbing the back of his head. Field suddenly asked where Lunasis was and turned his head in different directions, trying to find her. The girl was surprised to notice that her sister had only recently been next to her. Suddenly the elves froze in a respectful bow, letting the majestic king of the elves pass ahead. Gaius stood next to the young man and called him by name. He waved his hand, signaling his subjects to rise, and asked Field if he was having a good time. The youth answered in the affirmative, and the king added that the feast was in full swing, so he should not be shy. Gaius lowered his eyes slightly and noted that the energy that filled the forest would be enough for 5 generations to come. He sincerely said that he thanked the young man with all his heart, because without his help, they would have died in a couple of decades. Then the Elven King added that although Field might think this was too small a reward, he still wanted to give him something. The young man mentally asked himself how many 5 generations of elves were, and raised his palms when he heard about the gift. He quickly rattled off that he shouldn't give him anything, because the king had already given him an elven sword, which was more than enough for the young man, and he couldn't even dream of more. The king waved his words away, saying that the sword was nothing. Gaius reached into his robe and pulled out a beautiful brooch. He placed it in his palm, allowing the young man to examine its beauty from all sides. Field looked at the decoration in surprise, asking what kind of brooch it was and what kind of artifact it was. Next to him, Illumina froze in shock, her mouth hanging open in shock as she realized what was in front of her. The Elven King came very close to the young man. He reached out and touched his tie, saying that the brooch was a symbol of succession to the throne, passed on by the current king to his successor. It was passed down from generation to generation. Gaius came even closer and insistently noted that Field was the savior of their country, and legends about his exploits would be told in their country for many centuries to come. The young man tried to move a little further away, feeling uncomfortable. The Elven King squeezed Field's tie in his hands and began to release the precious brooch into his palm. With an insistent but gentle expression on his face, he asked the young man to become a light, and hoped that he would do much for their country. Field's skin crawled at the man's actions. He mentally noted the strange atmosphere around him and how things were starting to take an unpleasant turn, and the brooch was sinking lower and lower. Then someone suddenly grabbed the young man by the hand. He felt surprised when he was pulled to the side. It turned out that he had been saved by Lunasis, who now held his hand with a sweet smile and led him forward, away from his father. She smiled brightly at the young man, her cheeks shining with a blush. The elf asked him to go with her, and noted what kind of a feast it would be if the main star of the evening did not dance. Field looked at the beautiful girl in front of him in amazement, admiring her. He smiled tenderly at her and joyfully said her name. The elves around watched in awe as the couple took to the dance floor. The young man remarked that he didn't know how to dance, to which Lunasis reassured him, telling him to just follow her and everything would be fine. They began to dance. Field tried to keep up with the girl's movements and, embarrassed and worried, asked her where she had been and shared with her that he felt out of place because of the guests' looks at him. Lunasis was silent, not commenting on this. Suddenly she grabbed him by the neck with her gloved hand and pulled him sharply closer to her. Their faces were dangerously close to each other, which the young man could not help but notice, and he immediately blushed with embarrassment. The elf wrapped her arms around his neck and brought his face closer to hers, carefully pronouncing his name. Field froze, feeling her touch. After that, Lunasis was silent and he only looked at her with wide eyes. After some time, the king of the elves approached his daughter, asking her where Mr. Field was. Lunasis noted that the young man was simply tired of everyone's attention, so he decided to take a break from the crowd of guests. Gaius raised his hand to his face and froze when his daughter turned to him. She asked him not to joke like that again. The elven king covered his mouth with the sleeve of his ceremonial cloak and asked if she really took it as a joke, since Field only had to swear an oath and he would announce the news in front of everyone. Lunasis shouted at him, and he only chuckled. She noted that she knew about his plans, because he had planned to do this from the very beginning, but the elf firmly said that Mr. Field's power should belong only to himself. She whispered to him where his equipment was. Looking at her father, Lunasis firmly said that she would not allow him to take away the boy's freedom, because this was the only way she could repay him for his help. As she spoke, she placed her hand on her chest, showing how much this mattered to her. The elf still stood in this pose and was worried, waiting for her father's verdict. He said that he understood her point of view and this time he would retreat from his plans. The elven king noted that during their conversation he had noticed how easy it was to influence Field, and if he was so lost from such a small amount of pressure, then a difficult future awaited him. Gaius narrowed his eyes and continued his speech with the hope that Lunasis would be able to repay the young man for all the good, no matter whether it would be connections or something else. The king noted that perhaps Field would need some help or a romantic relationship. He would always be welcome in the land of the elves. And then he laughed at the displeased expression on his daughter's face. Standing opposite the young man who clasped his hands behind his head, Lunasis thought that, as she had seen, it had not worked out with her father. Field's memories. A crowded square of a large city through which a stately warrior walks and behind him moves a cart with his booty. The townspeople have gathered in the square, talking excitedly. Some say that this is the triumphant return of the Knights of the Order, while others shout the captain's name. Young Claude stands in the crowd and grumbles with hostility. Little Field walks with a large backpack on his back, looking at the people around him with surprise. Claude leaves the square and hurries the boy after him. He obediently follows him, continuing to look back at the knight. He asks if the captain of the knights is very strong. The man indifferently confirms this, saying that he is the strongest soldier in the country. Field freezes, realizing something. He tells himself with realization this is why the knight has such a high level. Claude turns around in surprise, hearing the boy's words. He looks intently at the child in front of him. Field holds the straps of his backpack tightly in his palms and looks back at the man just as intently. Claude carefully asks if the boy can see other people's levels. At that moment, Field's eyes sparkle and information about the person begins to be read in them. The guy looks at the boy with interest and asks again if he has really learned to analyze other people. He gently strokes the boy's head, praising him. Remarks that although it is not the most useful skill in battle, any guild can accept Field with open arms because of it. He asks him again with excitement. Enthusiastically asks what level the knight captain was. Field tells him that it was something like 68. Then the young man asks about his level and hears in response that he is level 5. At this time, a dissatisfied Claude hits on the back. Hearing about such a low level, became a little sad, and Claude, on the contrary, burst into laughter, teasing him that his number is not even double-digit. He asks in response about his partner's level, and Field answers that Claude is level 6. Now it was Yura's turn to laugh at his partner, and both young men grabbed each other. A confused Field watched all this. The boy added, opening the skill window, that he could share his experience, which would allow them to become stronger. He swiped his finger across the screen, explaining that he only needed to swipe his finger and the experience would be shared between them. Yer and Claude froze in amazement, looking at the boy, who added that perhaps this was another way to use his ability to analyze. Late evening. At this time, almost all members of the detachment were fast asleep, some in tents and some while on duty. While some were sleeping, others were hunting. A large rabbit was creeping across a forest clearing, trying to sense danger and escape from it if necessary. But then, with one sharp swing of the bow and a shot arrow, the rabbit fell shot. Yer and Claude talked during the hunt about the boy's strength. Someone said that he had never heard of such abilities to pass on his experience to someone. He noted with disbelief that their experience continued to grow because Field was with them and asked his partner if he had heard of such a thing. He replied that such a thing could not be, and Yer agreed with him. He noted that Field would become a very strong adventurer. They came close to the edge. Claude continued to try to convince his friend, noting that they would no longer have to be in this guild with the boy, and their desire to create the best guild in the country would no longer be an impossible dream. Yer shook his head. He resolutely answered him that he knew about his dream, and he was ready to support his friend with all his might. But there was something else for him. Yer turned to Claude and thought it was right for Field to decide for himself how to use his ability. He continued, noting that it was not for them to tell him what to do, and also saying that his ability was very unusual, which made him worry about other people wanting to take him in. Claude stood in the shadows, his face dark and unreadable. The dark-haired man slowly began to approach Yer while he stood near the edge of the cliff. He noticed that Field was still too small. Yer smiled widely, closing his eyes, and noted that they would protect the boy. Claude took advantage of the few seconds of Yura's lapse in vigilance and abruptly thrust his hand forward, forcefully pushing the young man off the edge of the cliff. He lost his footing and began to fall into the abyss. Yura's eyes widened. He couldn't even fully comprehend what had happened. For a split second, he looked at his friend in front of him in surprise and made a questioning sound. Claude, still standing with his hand outstretched, looked back in amazement, not believing that he had done such a thing. Fear was evident on his face. The full moon illuminated the forest clearing with its light. Awakened by the noise, all members of the detachment stood up and listened with disbelief to the news that Yer had died. Their faces were distorted with surprise. Claude, sobbing, covered his face with his hand, apologizing for what happened and telling his version of events, how they were surrounded by demons and Yer fell from the cliff. Bonsa, in a panic, asked what they should do now, to which he was told that they needed to wait until morning. Field was sobbing desperately, mourning his good friend. Tears were streaming down his face and he was sniffling. Suddenly, someone spoke to him. Claude stood in front of him and asked the boy in a serious voice not to tell anyone about his abilities. The man noted that Yer was worried about him until the very end and asked him not to worry. The man placed a black-gloved hand on the tearful boy's shoulder, and Field looked at it with fear. In a voice that dripped with madness and conviction, Claude said that he would set the boy on the right path. Claude's face was in the shadows again, hidden in the darkness of poisonous dreams. He said with conviction that for Yura's sake they would create the strongest guild in the world, and asked the boy if he was with him in this. With tears in his eyes, Field looked at the man, listening to Claude's fanatical promises and trying to understand the man's goal. Suddenly, someone insistently called Field's name. The young man was torn away from his memories, returning to the real world. Lunasis turned to him and asked if something so urgent had happened that he was so daydreaming. Field shook his head and said that nothing had happened. He wanted to add something but stopped himself, unable to find the words. The boy simply repeated that nothing had happened. Lunasis looked at him carefully, while Illumina, who was walking in front, hummed a song to herself. Field added that he was just lost in thought, which was why he was so absent-minded. Illumina, seeing something ahead, enthusiastically pointed at it with her finger, shouting to her sister that there was a castle ahead and asking her if they were going there. Lunasis scolded her sister and told her not to run so fast, otherwise she would fall again. She indignantly asked when this had happened and added that she was no longer a child. Field only sighed with a smile, listening to the squabble between the sisters. The three of them approached the large gates that opened the way to the ancient city. With anticipation and a smile, they went to meet new adventures. Experience sharing, the ability to share one's own experience with a group or guild members. Additionally, when a person with this ability is in a group, it increases the amount of experience they receive. By the time the Dawn of Glory Guild became the best guild of all, Field Electoria was expelled from it. The young man decided to live a free and lonely life, so he continued his journey. But by a strange coincidence, he ended up in the lands of the elves with the holy swordswoman Lunasis. Field's journey continued. accompanied by the elven princesses and sisters Lunasis and Illumina. Two big eyes watched with close attention as a large fish swam in an aquarium. Looked with delight at an aquarium with fish swimming in it on one of the shelves of the cabinet. She did not take her eyes off it, looking closely and carefully touching the glass with one hand. Emboldened, the girl carefully took the aquarium with both hands, lifting it from the counter. Suddenly, someone called her name and she turned around in surprise. Her older sister, Lunasis, stood next to her, smiling and leaning slightly toward her. She asked her to be careful because the fish were for sale. Illumina quickly agreed. The girl added that this was her first visit to a human settlement, so she hadn't thought about it. But then her sister covered her mouth with her hand, not letting her finish. Lunasis called her to look at the accessories together and on the other side too. Illumina tried to say something to her indignantly through her closed mouth. Field watched all this awkwardly, and behind him, the little man was glad that the sister of the holy swordswoman was also enjoying herself. He added that he never thought that the boy would form a group with the holy swordswoman Lunasis, concluding that he always knew what an unusual person Field was. The boy quickly raised his palms and hurriedly tried to explain that it was not like that. Beside them, Lunasis tried to get her sister to talk less. Field noted that the group he was currently in was something of a temporary contract. The little man with the mustache said enthusiastically, noting that it was great. The young man froze in amazement, looking at him with surprise. The man folded his hands in front of him and said that the best part was sharing the enjoyment of beautiful views with his companions. He noted that good friends and travel could help a person grow. He noticed that Field now looked much more like an adventurer than before. The young man stood, listening attentively to the man's words. Field replied that they had only met a few months ago and that he was just doing what he had always wanted to do. The man only laughed good-naturedly at his words, noting that it was not time that was important but experience. He put his hand on the young man's shoulder and patted him on it, saying that he had been thinking about one thing for a long time. The man leaned very close to Field's face, invading his personal space and asking about the sword behind his back, asking the boy to let him look at it. He took out a special lens and carefully examined through it the legendary elven sword lying on his table. Looking at the sword with a careful eye, the man noticed that it was a stunning object and asked where Field got such a work of art. He awkwardly scratched the back of his head and answered evasively that he was given the sword for several reasons. The man added that the sword had amazing detailing and asked if it was enchanted. He noted that dwarves often made such things and that the sword could be one of them. Field asked again, repeating the words about dwarves. The man noted that dwarves are blacksmiths by nature, and the armor they forge is often enchanted in this way. Many legendary armors are said to have been made by dwarves. The man noted that even if the armor was similar in shape, the price for a dwarf's work would be higher. Field awkwardly agreed with the information about the dwarves. Lunasis snuck up behind him and startled him by asking if he was interested in the land of the dwarves. The young man was very frightened. His heart almost jumped out of his chest. He asked with displeasure whether she had to sneak up from behind. The elf, with a satisfied look, made the observation that he was interested in the gnomes. The girl's lips stretched into a wide smile, and Field cautiously asked why she was smiling like that. Satisfied, Lunasis began to answer him. But then Illumina appeared from behind her and blurted out that the elves are in close relations with the country of the gnomes. The girl continued that they were even close acquaintances of their father, so she and her sister had also met them. Not expecting such a setup, Lunasis became despondent because she wanted to tell about it herself. Field said that the gnomes were not hiding, so he did not understand the fuss around all this information. Illumina stood with a satisfied smile and only snorted loudly at the young man's words. She said that in the land of the gnomes, where the workshops of the best craftsmen are gathered, there is a very strict entry system. So a person like Field, especially one who came there for the first time, would be refused. But then Illumina quickly added that she and her sister could ask the dwarves for a personal meeting. Not believing his ears, Field's eyes widened, and he asked if she was really serious. With a wide and sly smile on her face, the girl looked at him and asked if he would like to go there. Field's eyes instantly widened as he imagined the glittering riches of the dwarf country and the good fortune it would bring him. Illumina joyfully and contentedly shouted that now everything was decided. Lunasis could only stand disappointedly on the sidelines and watch as her younger sister took all the glory. They said goodbye to the merchant at the porch of his shop, waving their hands cheerfully and friendly at him. The travelers split up. Lunasis, walking next to her sister, said that they should return to the inn before sunset. Illumina asked if Field would go with them. The young man went in the other direction and only waved goodbye to them. The girl asked why she and the young man could not walk around the city together, since it was a great opportunity to learn about human settlements. Lunasis didn't answer her sister and told her to hold her hand, because there were a lot of people on the street. Illumina noticed with displeasure that she was holding her child again. The girl continued discontentedly, saying that Lunasis should know what kind of magic she has, and as an adventurer she can stand up for herself. The older elf only sighed, listening to her sister's indignation. The older elf leaned closer and said with a gentle smile that she just wanted to hold hands with Illumina. She asked if that couldn't be done. Lunasis extended her hand to her and added that she was a little embarrassed when she was with Field. Illumina looked at the outstretched hand in surprise. After thinking, the girl put her small palm into her sister's palm, which surprised the girl a little. Illumina said that if her sister said so, then nothing could be done. Lunasis smiled sweetly, glad that her sister agreed. At this time, Field was walking around the city on the other side. He clasped his hands behind his head and yawned widely, deciding to check out other shops along the way. Someone poked him lightly in the side. The young man lowered his hands and turned around, seeing a little girl in front of him. She was pulling at the fabric of his shirt and crying, loudly sniffling. Sniffling, the girl asked Field if he knew how to get to the flower shop. The young man just looked at her in surprise. With both hands, the guy gently squeezed the hand of the girl, who said that she knew about his belonging to the adventurers, because behind his back there was a cool sword. Field led the girl towards the flower shop. As they walked, the girl asked him if he had killed monsters before. The young man answered in the affirmative, showing how huge the monster was. The girl said her mother had told her about how adventurers sometimes try to show off and give things in smaller sizes, which is a problem. Field froze, asking about her mother. The girl nodded and shared that her mother works as a secretary in a well-known and recognizable guild. Field froze, trying to comprehend this information. The girl continued walking, stamping her feet along the road. Suddenly, it dawned on the young man, and he remembered the woman he had once met in the Adventurers Guild, who had greeted him kindly. Field looked at the girl in surprise when she said that it was her mother's birthday today. She clutched a small bouquet of flowers and frowned, trying to guess her mother's reaction to her actions. She added that she wanted to go to the flower shop but left without telling her mother. Now she wonders if she is mad at her. The girl felt a gloved hand fall on her head and stroke her head in a comforting gesture, trying to cheer her up. Field sat down in front of her and smiled brightly, saying that her mother was definitely not angry. He noted that she might be very worried about her, but the girl would apologize and she would forgive her, and her mother would really like the gift. The girl asked if it was true, and the young man answered in the affirmative. At that moment, some ragamuffin began to walk past them on the street. Passers-by looked at him with displeasure as he walked, rustling along the pavement and scratching his bandaged arm. Field noted that her mother might be angry with her too, so she shouldn't be afraid. The young man took her hand and wanted to resume the movement. He noted that since she already had the flowers, all he had to do was call the guards, and then hesitantly asked if there was a post nearby. It was at this moment that the ragged stranger came very close, walking down a narrow alley. They both did not look around, which led to their shoulders lightly touching. Field quickly turned around and began to quickly apologize to the stranger for bumping into him. But he froze when he met his gaze. In front of him was his old acquaintance Claude, who was not looking his best. Both stopped and looked at each other. Claude turned to face him. Field asked in surprise, looking for confirmation that it was really him in front of him. The man's lips stretched into a wide, sharp smile, and he let out a loud laugh that had a hint of madness in it. He greeted Field mockingly, noting that he had grown into a fine man. The young man covered the girl with his hand and ordered her to leave. Claude added that he had heard rumors about his party with the Holy Swordswoman. The man started talking about how Field had abandoned them and started spending time with a beautiful girl, giggling and asking if he really had a great life as an adventurer. The boy made a face, noting that they had kicked him out. Claude didn't stop scratching his bandaged hand. He said that since their last meeting he had been through a lot, because the king had not left them alone and the guild had been accused, which led to its dissolution. He started talking about the other members and fell silent. The silence was deafening to him. Field asked him again, asking if he was talking about Dorothy and the others. He asked what had happened to them. Claude shrank even more, trying to cover himself with his long hair. He said that there were no more guild officers. He hunched over in his black tattered cloak, standing opposite the young man. Field asked if this was really the case and mentally decided that everyone had gone their separate ways because of the dissolution of Dawn of Glory. He noted that they were a bunch of idiots, but that didn't mean they had to mess with him now. While the boy was thinking, Claude put his hand in his sleeve, trying to feel something. Field tried to ask the man if he really had come for him, but was stopped by a blade being thrown at him with the blade aimed at his eye. The young man quickly caught it with his palm, preventing it from harming himself. He was surprised, not expecting such an action. Claude resolutely confirmed his words, saying that of course he had come for him. Without raising his head, he took out another knife. The man quickly approached and swung his arm, aiming at Field's face, but he quickly dodged. Claude said loudly that this was revenge. He found support in his legs for the next more precise blow. Claude screamed with hatred about how a distributor who manipulates people can enjoy life. The man continued his thought, saying that people like him had to crawl on the ground like insects. He seldom swung his sword and began to approach the young man with a shout. Pointing his sword at him, Claude shouted in a rage that it was all his fault. But as the blade approached him, Field caught the man's hand and pulled it away from his face. He looked at Claude with disdain and indifference, squeezing his palm tighter. The young man, continuing to hold the man's hand, leaned slightly to the side and grabbed his clothes, bringing him closer to himself. He pulled with all his might. Field said loudly enough and then threw him powerfully forward away from himself. Claude crashed into the wall. The man cleared his throat slightly. Despite the blow, he continued to chuckle slightly. Claude noted that the look on the boy's face said that he did not consider him worthy of dying by his hand. Field asked him why he had gone so far. Claude chuckled, his lips curling into a contemptuous smile. He said that he couldn't forgive him, so for him it was just a little fight. The man laughed madly again, the veins on his face bulging from the tension in his entire body. Claude crouched down, showing his empty, bandaged hands. He noted that it was a way to let off steam and see Field's face twisted in pain. A terrible smile flickered across his lips. The young man looked at him carefully, observing his actions. He suddenly noticed that the man did not have a knife in his hands. And suddenly he felt a blade fly past him. Steel flashed in his eyes as Field tried to get his bearings. A girl with a bouquet appeared nearby. She asked worriedly how he was and if he had any wounds. The knife flew straight towards her, hovering above her. Field saw this and quickly turned around, his eyes widening in fear. The young man concentrated all his strength in his body in order to have time to react and quickly catch the knife, not allowing it to touch the child.